The proceeding will...
Order, order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Wednesday, the 21st of February 2024. Today we're looking at how government handles resilience against major events, and we're particularly focusing as an example on extreme weather, but we are keen to look at government's resilience more generally. But recent events have included some major weather events, severe storms, high temperatures, droughts. They've all had a huge impact on individuals, businesses and communities, and they highlight the huge challenges that are faced by the UK from these risks. And of course we've come through recently the pandemic, which underlines the need to have resilience built into the system to deal with future emergencies. There are mechanisms in place, and we're grateful to the National Audit Office for its work previously for us on risk, but obviously on its report that we're looking at today on particularly focusing on extreme weather. But the extreme weather really is an illustrative example for this session, and we do want to look wider at the resilience issues in government. And of course this committee has previously urged government to set up a national risk officer to deal with these issues, as you would have sort of in the banking world, and it's pleased to have Mr. Clive Martin here, who's the nearest thing we have to that, I think, at the moment. But I'll introduce our witnesses. And before I do that, I do want to thank everyone who's contributed. Really a lot of really good evidence from other bodies have been put in today, so apologies if we don't give it all justice in the room, but it will make it's helped us in our preparation and will help us in writing our future report. So I'd like to introduce from my left to right, I think is easier. So we have Professor Penelope Endersby, who's the Chief Executive of the Met Office. A real pleasure to welcome you, Professor Endersby. And she is next to Tamara Finkelstein, known to this committee obviously as the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Next to her is Matthew Clarke, who's the Resilience Director at the Cabinet Office. And next to him is Roger Hargreaves, who's the Director of the COBR unit, again at the Cabinet Office, and Clive Martin, who I mentioned before, who's the Head of the Government Risk Profession and the Government Finance Function at the Cabinet Office. So a warm welcome to you. Ordinarily we would have the Accounting Officer for the Cabinet Office here, but he is about to leave the Civil Service, so we will just want to flag now that his successor will be someone we'll be continuing to raise this discussion with, and we expect a follow-up session with them at some point when they're appointed. So thank you very much indeed for coming. We have no declarations of interest or nothing to raise at the top, so I want to go straight to you, if I may, Mr. Clarke, and ask you how resilient you think the UK is currently. Big question.
So let me just
time, that's fine.
I'm sorry.
Don't worry.
So first of all, I wanted to start on how the government defines resilience, and that is an ability to withstand or quickly recover from a difficult situation, but also to get ahead of those risks and tackle the challenges before they manifest. And this covers the UK's ability to anticipate, assess, prevent, mitigate, respond and recover from those risks. Key new governance and processes and capabilities, which I hope I'll have an opportunity to talk about today, the training and the products that we have put out as the Resilience Directorate in the last 18 months, mean that we are better prepared across all these dimensions. The capabilities assessment, first of all, included looking at plans and procedures, personnel across the system, infrastructure and logistics, equipment and supplies, legislation and doctrine. So really looking across the piece and testing against benchmarks how well set up we are for resilience across government. And in terms of how resilient the UK is generally a resilient country. We have stable utility supplies, and by and large people go about their day-to-day business without having to worry about there being clean water to drink or electricity coming out the sockets. But of course we can't be complacent on that. In the 23-24 winter season, we responded to 10 named storms, and of course 242,000 properties were better protected across England by flood and coastal risk management schemes. During Storm Babette, Kieran and Henk, which is a significant success when compared with approximately 6,300 flooded. So to reiterate that, 242,000 protected, 6,300 flooded, but not to downplay the impact of that. The fact that there was no escalation to the COBR unit, a COBR committee level response, that it was not required for any of those storms is testament really to our effective response structures and at the local and national levels. But of course we are committed to strengthening UK resilience, and we've done this by creating the Resilience Directorate, for which I am the head of resilience, and the new cross-government governance for resilience overseen by the Deputy Prime Minister. We have a far-reaching plan. This is the resilience framework that stretches to 2030, and that's to strengthen our national resilience. And that resilience framework was published in December 2022 in fulfilment of a commitment made in the integrated review. And we're now working to deliver that plan. If I can just say a little more, in December, the Deputy Prime Minister provided the first update to Parliament on resilience. Yep. And this was accompanied by the implementation update, which set out a range of activities that have been put in place, again, which I can talk about in more detail later perhaps, the National Risk Register, the capabilities assessment, the work we're doing on critical national infrastructure, which really shows that there has been good progress made and we are in a good place on resilience.
Okay, so I mean, one of the things here is determining the risk appetite for government, and so I'm not quite sure where that falls between, if we talk less about the weather than more about the general resilience. What is the risk appetite? I mean, it's a difficult question perhaps for you to answer alone, but you've got to put up advice to ministers about the various risks that are in front of us and what level of risk we take. There'll always be a risk for government, so what is the risk appetite in government and how do you determine that and how do you advise on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a bit about how we think about that as a concept. So it will very much depend on the risk in question, of course, and will involve understanding the impacts of those risks. So first off, we have the National Security Risk Assessment that defines the key risks that we need to be prepared for across the country and what the impact of those risks would be. In terms of risk appetite, then that's the kind of equation. What do we do about those risks? What's the appetite to act on those, and what's the residual risk, and how do you want to act on those? So that is the data which we are collating across the system. We've done the capabilities assessment, looking at how well prepared departments are. We are looking across the critical national infrastructure and the interdependencies and where those vulnerabilities may be. And I think it's a case-by-case decision really to be taken to ministers about, this is the risk, this is how well prepared we are for it, these are where the vulnerabilities sit. This would be the action that we could take against those risks, and this would be the costs and potentially the trade-offs. And then ministers can make a rational decision based on that. But as I say, it will be case by case versus a full resilient system. This is the risk appetite there.
If I may just turn to Mr. Martin. Mr. Martin, as head of the risk profession, every department will make its own assessment, and as Mr. Clarke says, then we know there's the National Risk Register with 89 major national risks on it. There's other risks at different levels. But who's overseeing what the balance is between those? Because there's going to be a finite amount of money in any situation, and it will be ultimately goes all the way to the top. The Prime Minister ultimately would have to decide on these things across the piece. So what's the best practice, and what work still needs to be done in government to make sure that we're having a full whole government approach to risk, and what needs to improve?
This risk appetite is quite easy to seek, quite difficult to express sometimes, but always important to consider. And my colleagues do that in relation to the sorts of risks that we're outlining earlier on, both risk by risk and then sometimes in aggregate in terms of what sort of responses would work well, whatever causes the disruption in the first place. More broadly, risk management decisions in government follow the governance arrangements of government, and therefore flow from departments through permanent secretaries and ministers to cabinet ultimately. To support that activity, there is cross-government work that is done through meetings like the Civil Service Board, for example, where they talk about cross-cutting risks in order to be able to support the decision-making through the line management and government governance arrangements.
Okay, so you've got, we've seen we'll be looking at preparations for COVID and other things. I mean, things like decisions on funding can be very much in the moment in the political cycle. Do you think we've seen a change of attitude since COVID to how risk is managed? Your own role is a change, indeed, but anything else?
Yeah, so I wasn't in government at the time of COVID, so I don't know what the situation was then, but I found people to be very supportive to the work that I'm doing, but also the work that others are doing in relation to risk across government. There's a clear desire to do more of what we can in relation to cross-government collaboration on areas of resilience or risk management more broadly. There's a desire for people to be better connected and to be able to understand best practice in one place, apply it in others, and I'm playing my part in trying to oil the wheels of that activity.
So, I mean, we go back perhaps between Mr. Clarke and Mr. Martin. I mean, we talk about determining the risk appetite, but then what would you, if you can codify, tell us what you think the desired outcomes would be of that exercise? That's not a very clear question, sorry. I mean, so you've got to determine what the risk appetite is of government, and then you've got to really outline very clearly what you want to see happen as a result of that. So can you point us to where you would do that and how far that work has progressed?
Yeah, so certainly we've done, as I said, the different things that are giving us the data to know where the gaps may be, the vulnerabilities may be. The National Security Council Resilience has taken several matters where there are decisions to be made about an activity which will take resources or sometimes spending as well. What we haven't done is across the 89 risks that are in the National Risk Register determined what Minister's risk appetite is, because we very much work on a generic capabilities approach. We couldn't have the resources, finite resources, to look at each of those 89 in detail and decide where risk appetite lies. But our approach very much looks at instead those generic capabilities, so looking across the utilities, for example, whether it be gas or water or telecoms, looking across health systems, abilities to deal with events. What we can do is make sure that the resources are in place for each of those generic capabilities. So that
how will you know what will be the indicators when you've achieved the outcome you want to make sure all those are lined up ready to deal with any future risks?
I think one of the ways is through the capabilities assessment we've done, where we've looked at each of those functions across the government departments. We have effectively rated the departments, or at least sort of set out where we think the strengths are, where there's room for improvement. Overall,
test those, and do you do exercises? Have you had any tests on the resilience?
We've had several tests. Yeah.
So, which particular areas? What scenarios have you tested? If you're able to share that with us, I appreciate some maybe security beyond this committee, but
yeah. Well, a big example is an exercise on a national power outage, for example, where I think a couple of thousand people were involved across the system, so not just in central government, but out to local partners. Including wider communities as well, and really just putting in the scenario, if you like, and seeing how the response works with those different injectors, they're called, those different prompts, as the scenario progresses. And
do you have a plan for those scenarios going forward?
Yes, and in fact there's a national exercise programme which has been developed looking ahead for the next 5 years, and what that does is look at, again, where there are, I mean, at the most basic level, it kind of looks at the stock of exercises that are currently taking place across all the different parts of the country. But then it really adds the value, because we can see through that capabilities assessment where there is a need to improve in a particular area. It could be a particular sector, it could be a particular department, it could be something thematic like cyber security or something to do with an energy outage, as I said. And then it will make sure that the national exercising programme really works at those different things that need to be tested and exercised over time. Then there's a process that feeds back into the system, so it's not just do the exercise, move on. It's very much around capturing the lessons, putting those lessons in the Lessons Digest, which is something that we publish every 6 months and which goes out, and which there has been very good reception, and then checking that those lessons have been learnt as well. So there's several ways of checking that the system is robust.
Those generic capabilities, I mean, that's quite a reactive approach. One of the key things we saw with COVID was there was a lot of very good reaction. Whitehall stepped up, did a lot of really good things, and we as a committee picked apart those things. Not everything worked as well as it could have done, but people did step up. but what was missing was the pre-planning for that. So how are you making sure that government's getting ahead of the significant risks that you're looking at? And I mean, other members may want to come in as well. Mr. Clarke, to start with you.
Yeah, and again, this comes back to the National Security Risk Assessment, the National Risk Register, the capability assessment that underpins that, and really making sure that we have those generic capabilities in place. So whether it's a power outage, and that will have knock-on impacts for other sectors and other departments as well. We know that the departments are fit and ready to stand up and respond to what might be a power outage incident. But equally, you will find that during a pandemic, for example, you will see similar challenges to whether it be schools staying open or testing the health system, the local response and the central government response. So it's really testing that system is fit to go for whatever might be thrown at it in terms of challenges.
And just before I go to Ms. Finkelstein, I mean, how severe were some of the test runs you've done or are going to do? Because COVID threw up a lot more. It was often the early tests had been on health, and they hadn't taken into account always some of the other aspects. So how severe are you judging? And maybe Mr. Hargreaves might want to come in on that. Yeah. Either of all, it doesn't have to be both.
I'm just going to reference briefly, so the Deputy Prime Minister in his annual update to Parliament said that we have a piece of work going on called the Catastrophic Impacts Programme, and that really is looking at those cascading risks across sectors, so one sector affecting many others, and making sure that the arrangements are in place to deal with it, exactly that. So it's where we really are testing the system for the most severe it can get effectively, and that programme is in place. When
severe risk happens, Mr. Hargreaves, it falls to you to pick it up and...
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, there's actually a very clear cascade of how the risk is identified and managed and the decisions are taken around it. Because as Dr. Clarke says, the NSRA sets out for each of almost 100 risks a set of scenarios from which fall planning assumptions, and it very clearly outlines the capabilities that are required to meet the risk as it's described in its reasonable worst case form. So individual departments will take decisions, either individually or perhaps collectively on some issues, around how far we go towards developing those requirements. And the reason why it's difficult, I think, to have a single risk appetite is because risks themselves vary. So to give a simple example, we accept in the way that society operates that, say, 1,000 people will be killed every year on the roads. We're much more tolerant of that risk than we are of a single terrorist event that might kill 1,000 people, because it says something about our political system, the stability of society and so forth. So different risks will have different appetites, and that's why the NSRA sets out different capabilities. When it comes to exercising, we design exercises so they are trying to drive out of the system revealed preferences, because looking at something in abstract is not always the most productive thing. And certainly with COVID, we saw a lot of revealed preferences in the moment that hadn't come out through exercising previously. The challenge is creating that sense of jeopardy in the exercise that real ministers feel in real life when push comes to shove. And we've really tried to up the demands in exercises, up the frequency and up the intensity of them, so we get those preferences out of people. It's not the only way to test the plans. You can kind of test them objectively against the capability requirements, and as Dr. Clarke has said, that work is done on a variety of different levels. But I think we see exercises as a really good way to drive that kind of revealed preferences bit out of the system.
Ms. Finkelstein, you've been in the hot seat.
I don't know if it's helpful to say how does that then play through for a department, because actually that capabilities work and that capabilities assessment was something, and actually the outcome of the exercise that Dr. Clarke set out about power outage gave information to my executive committee we looked at, and as a result of which we've set up a resilience board and asked for quite a lot of information so that we can track our improvements against those capabilities because of that assessment, which we'll be able to feed back. And I've just noted really quite a step up really with the creation of Dr. Clarke's team and that kind of work of the way in which we look at these issues against others. When I look at my risk register, alongside some of the kind of big corporate risks, we've added looking at the NSRA risks and some of the other information that we're getting from that directorate, alongside some of our very near-term risks, and we look at that as a package. We've definitely taken a step up in that direction. And then maybe just to mention, it is that real challenge about that risk appetite, and on the two sort of areas that were in the report around us on drought, we actually have set this 1 in 500 year risk of drought to protect against, which the water companies need to do plans against, and we look at, and they set their investment alongside meeting that. We had conversations before about on flooding, have we got that in the right place? And both you and the National Infrastructure Commission have sort of challenged us on that, and we will be doing work at looking what works in that space. It's just really hard to get something that will work. And I do think that the team is right in saying that we need to look at that in particular areas, and then we need to look at what's our investment against that. Because although you could say, well, what's our risk overall, and the sort of set of resilience risks, but in the end that's competing against other financial questions. So really it's got to then all come together in a spending review, where I think this set of risks and adaptation risks, which I'm sure we'll come to, now have a much stronger, it's looked at alongside other things in a strengthened way, as I perceive it.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Professor Endersby.
Thank you very much. And just to build on the points to my left, I think that for risks where we're the lead government department, particularly for heat, where the risk may not be stable. So with climate change, we know that some weather and climate risks are escalating. We have the capability to predict to some extent how those will escalate, and we do respond to that. So with heat, we introduced the heat warning in 2021 ahead of the extreme heat in 2022. It might not have been the next year, but it wasn't luck that we added that tool to government's playbook. And equally, one of the areas where we anticipate there will be an increasing risk on the surface water flooding, there's work going on between us and DEFRA to prepare for that, because it is an area where forecasting and warning and responding are particularly challenging.
Indeed, and we've touched on that in a previous inquiry we've done, and we will come to that in more detail. I just want to go finally back to Mr. Clarke before I pass on to Mr. Lake. One of the things that we've been puzzling as we've been looking at this is what measures of what a good outcome will look like. So you talked earlier about, what was it? I think 6,000 properties flooded, but 242,000 saved. So was there a measure in that? And why aren't you getting more direct measures so that you can actually really be clear what you've achieved? And it's interesting that the Australian government has also issued statements of responsibilities as well for the different bodies involved. So if you could answer both those questions, please, and then I'll move on.
Yeah, certainly. So just coming first to the responsibilities, there is a lead government department list which sets out very clearly the roles and responsibilities of government departments for the sectors they are responsible for. And also in the Civil Contingencies Act, it sets out very clearly the roles of the response community effectively there. So you have... That's
mostly local government, police, fire and so on, isn't it?
That's correct, but Category 2 responders can also include the utilities who provide those critical services.
What about other businesses and the third sector, like the Australians?
So there are not defined, encoded sort of responsibilities there, but we do work very closely with the voluntary sector, the communities, and we have guidance in terms of how we interact with those. We have the UK Resilience Forum to bring them around the table as well.
On just that before we go back to you, Mr. Hargreaves, you want to
the obligations are clear on those businesses that matter.
Critical infrastructure.
And the voluntary sector, or the local responders are obliged to involve the voluntary sector as well. Those are all clear responsibilities in the Act, and we see lots of evidence of that manifesting in practice, and that's been a really helpful point of leverage where
you don't prescribe it from central government. You expect local councils with their gold group and reactive groups to work with their local voluntary sector groups. There's
detailed guidance.
Yeah,
I'd say that's true at the local level as well, but we are completely engaged with and working with the voluntary sector, with communities. The Deputy Prime Minister has his UK Resilience Forum, and that brings all of those parties together around the table, the response community, voluntary organisations, representatives of communities as well. So there's that bottom-up approach, if you like, in terms of how it's wired locally, but then at the top level as well, we're very much working on the design of the system and the framework with those communities.
And in terms of the outcomes, specifying very clear outcomes, why are you so reluctant to do that? Or is it a reluctance, or is it just too hard to do? Tell us.
It's not reluctance. Can I sort of properly explain this, because I think it comes to both standards and assurance and goals and targets. And I wanted to properly explain this because I think it speaks to many of the questions that have been the recommendations in the report. I think it's part of the same conversation. So standards can codify and provide the means to meet the goals and targets, and then assurance, of course, can...
We like measures, you see, because we need to see what's going on as politicians.
Absolutely, and the standards can set those measures that need to be met. They can be very outcome focused in terms of service level requirements on utilities, for example, or they can be quite specific. But I should say, usually prefer outcome focused, because then you know that the people who are applying the standards properly understand them, and they're not just sort of doing a tick box exercise. But I mean, just going back to the resilience framework, that set a commitment to put in place standards and a standards-based approach to assurance in place for those critical services by 2030. But I would also say that 2030 is a backstop date. It's not a target for us. And we and others want to put in place things sooner if we can, but very much 2030.
But the standards, the standards are fine, but if you've got an outcome you're aiming for, if you don't have an outcome, how do you know when you've got an extreme weather event and you put in all the resilience that you've actually achieved what you set out to do? You can't measure if you've got nothing to measure against.
Yeah, and I think there's a whole landscape actually of requirements and standards here. So government is one part of that equation, but I think it's really important to understand the framework, the landscape in which we're operating. So Ofgem, Ofcom, the Office for Nuclear Regulation, several regulators have requirements for resilience and standards that must be met in those sectors. That's part of the story. I think there are also horizontal standards that cross the sectors, like British Standard 65,000. That's around organisational resilience. That's another means of measuring an organisation's resilience according to that code.
Look, if you've got outcomes that you really know what you want to achieve, you're all competing for. Everyone in government's always competing for money, right? So if you've got to make a convincing case that investment to save and provide resilience is going to make a difference, so you've got to prove that when that investment is made, it gets a better outcome or greater resilience. I just still can't see where the measure is on that.
We're doing the work to decide how the government should take forward that requirement to put standards in place by 2030. But I was saying, there's a complex interaction between regulations. Do you want to have regulations underpinning those standards, those targets, the measurement of those goals? Or is it a voluntary nature? Are you relying on independent regulators, for example, to make sure that those standards that you have defined or they have defined are being met? So there's definitely the work happening. I have met kind of the Institute of Regulation, the UK Regulators Network. I've met all sorts of critical national infrastructure sectors to understand what is the approach that should be taken on these standards, what are the appropriate goals. And in many cases, they are in place there. For example, there is a guaranteed standard of performance that the Ofgem has in place for the electricity sector, a system restoration standard whereby the system has to be brought back within a defined period if it goes down.
That's a reactive thing. And what about the proactive things that would
standards to be met? But those, it's reactive in the sense that if something goes down, the standard needs to be met, coming back within 3 days or whatever it is. But I think striving to meet those standards is the preventative thing, the proactive.
I'm just aware of time, but Mr. Hargreaves wants to come in now.
We're necessarily going to have a combination of reactive and proactive standards. The Civil Contingencies Act is, by definition, a kind of proactive tool, and sometimes we get criticised as to why it's not more reactive. But we're going to end up with a combination of proactive and reactive, and statutory standards, regulatory standards, safety and operational standards, and the risk-driven standards I mentioned earlier that flow from the National Security Risk Assessment. So it means that we don't have a single package that sets out everything that allows it to be viewed in the whole, but that's what Dr. Clarke is referring to when he talks about the work that's underway. At the end of all this, though, there is a degree of political choice.
Yes.
We can identify 4 ministers against this range of standards and outcomes where we think there are deficiencies or where we think there are choices, either between risks or between a risk and an ordinary bit of day-to-day business. And what we endeavour to do is identify any shortfalls that we think are worrying and put those to ministers, but there will be a choice at the end of it, and it will be a choice about how resources are allocated.
Okay, I think we'll move on to Mr. Ben Lake for now.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, gentlemen. In answer to one of the Chair's questions, I think it was alluded to that the various tiers of government, organisations and private sector, what have you, would have an understanding of their roles and responsibilities. Now that would, if I have understood you correctly, that rather runs contrary to what the NAO report, paragraph 1.7 says about the need for a whole of society approach to achieve and develop national resilience, and actually the need for government to set out what the respective roles of central government, local government, devolved administrations, private and voluntary sectors, and indeed the public are. So have I misunderstood an answer that was given earlier?
Well, I mean, the Civil Contingencies Act sets out really, really clearly, in a way that's been copied in many countries around the world, a very precise set of expectations around the fullest possible range of response organisations. And the kind of obvious gap in it, the big question, and one that's addressed in the resilience framework, is should there be a set of parallel standards in relation to what central government does? And that's why there's a commitment in that framework to do precisely that bit of work.
Can I just come back further to that? And you mentioned whole of society, which is one of the three legs of the stool for the resilience framework. Yeah. Understanding of the risks, prevention is better than cure, whole of society approach. So that's why we are engaging. As we've been in existence for 18 months. We have put out a lot of really foundational products like the National Risk Register. There's more to come, like a public website, so the public know what their response activities can be, how they can be prepared. There's a survey due on public perception of risk, and on the back of that we will work out again how to engage with the public, how to really take forward actions that resonate with them that they can take. We have a voluntary sector forum where again we're kind of effectively consulting them, taking their views on how we can best encode their contributions as well, setting up a voluntary index so that people can link into those volunteering activities as well. So I think there's a golden thread through all that we do that is whole of society resilience, and we do have that commitment to kind of encode that and build that in as we go forward.
Thank you. In that regard then, I'm quite interested to better understand the way in which various public bodies, indeed private sector, will understand the responsibilities, and whether there's it may well be yourselves, a central authority that does and undertakes these regular checks to ensure that, one, a public authority in Wales will understand its roles and responsibilities, and two, that it has the actual funding and resourcing, the capability to fulfil those roles and responsibilities. So is there a central authority that would have that overarching, I suppose, view of things?
I mean, in the sense that I am the head of resilience, and I'm therefore responsible for setting direction, the framework that supports all of resilience, that is partly me, but you've mentioned Wales, of course, and work very closely with our colleagues in devolved nations as well. So I think the roles and responsibilities are clear. We're doing the work to set that out further. I think when it comes to spend as well, there was in the autumn statement, the Chancellor announced a £10 million fund, which is really to get the analysis that underpins where that money is best spent, where there are fiscal or economic risks involved. So the work is being done to underpin that. And what we are very closely thinking about as a directorate is working across government so that we can think across departmental boundaries at the system that we want here. So where there may be a case for spend in one department, but actually perhaps the money is better spent on a resilience activity in another department, we can have that conversation and we can look at the trade-offs between those policies. So that's very much the approach we take, including on important things like climate adaptation.
And in that regard, actually, there'll be, sadly, recent examples of storm activity, and of course, river systems don't respect sort of political boundaries. And I can well imagine that for the River Severn, for example, there would be a need for close cooperation between authorities, public authorities and otherwise, in Wales and in England. I'm just interested, is there, when you conduct these exercises across government, is there also an input for different tiers of government, and indeed, in this instance, Welsh Government and public authorities in Wales? Are those exercises done on a regular basis?
They are, and they're done at many different levels at the local level, across different countries. We do holistic ones. So yeah, very, very much so. And the League Government Department list is also very clear on the roles of devolved nations as well. And it is a collaborative thing because, of course, a power outage is not going to stop at national borders. So it's very collaborative. We have very good relationships. And the system that I'm trying to build is inclusive as well, although, of course, there will sometimes be devolved matters as well, which sometimes is the local response side of things.
Very pleased to hear that. And if I may just quickly turn then as well to the fact that, Dr. Clarke, you mentioned that assessments have been made of various tiers of government and their capability to respond to emergencies, but also to contribute to that national resilience. I'm interested in your last answer. You also alluded to budget changes. Are you finding any difficulties on, especially the local government level, in terms of funding decisions? And do we have the capability on a very local level that perhaps in yesteryear we could depend on, but in more recent times local government finding it difficult? Is that something that feeds into your plans?
It does very much feed into our plans. We work very closely with DLUC, the department that then is responsible for the local resilience forums and their counterparts as well, liaising with those in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland as well. I don't think I am able to comment on sort of funding problems there, but I would say that the local resilience forum setup is very effective. There has recently been some new funding announced, in particular to take forward some pilots which will really look at strengthening the role of LRFs in the local area and making sure that in all of the policies that are being taken forward in the local area, resilience is sort of front and foremost and considered in those wider policies as well, because resilience is quite hard to draw a boundary around. I mean, it can involve all sorts of things like local response, healthcare, the buildings themselves, so it's really important that it's factored into that wider policy as well. Thank you.
Anne-Marie Morris, MP.
Thank you. Clarke, climate change and the various other changes in our world lead us to try to ensure we have a resilient society which will survive and thrive. Yes. And effectively there are two parts to that. One, which is what the Climate Change Committee have been tasked with, is to look at how do we deal with trying to manage climate change, try to get it to arrive more slowly so we get to net zero, etc., etc. Then we get to the other side of it, which is adaptation, which is about looking at the long-term change. So ultimately the temperature is going to go up. We need to adapt, and that's all part of resilience. You've got the if you like, the reactive bit to the one-off or shorter term things that happen, and then you've got the long term. What I'm failing to hear, because it's as much of a risk as the short term, is what is in your plan and what government is doing in terms of managing the long term. I hear a little bit from Ms. Finkelstein in terms of the flooding and the drought, but if we take schools, are we looking, for example, as they do on continental Europe, changing school hours? Are we looking at when shops open, given the heat of the day? How much time is government spending to that longer term part of resilience, which we've all called adaptation?
Yep.
It seems less attractive and less urgent, but actually it's at least as urgent.
It is at least as urgent, and I would not argue against it being equally important. I should probably turn to colleagues here who can talk about the National Adaptation Programme, but first of all, just to say that at the centre we are very seized of adaptation. We have set up, so I co-chair with a director in DEFRA, the Climate Resilience Steering Board, which really makes sure that at a senior level across Whitehall, we really are considering what those climate adaptation impacts will be and building that into our resilience. Can you
give me some examples? Because I'm not hearing any examples as to what you're looking at, which is not a reaction to a one-off flood, drought, etc.
And again, there's a whole national adaptation programme which covers the huge amount of risks that the climate change committee has set out in terms of the risks, but specifically we have been thinking very much around extreme heat events and
that's an event. The
planning
change
for that event. So thinking
it will be a long term. It's not something which will happen and then go away again.
Totally. So what we have been doing is working with departments, workshopping with the sectors. What will the impacts be over time of temperature increases? Where might you need different forms of asphalt for the roads to make sure that they're resilient? What will the impact be on rail lines? And what will the impact be on people in care homes? what policies can be put in place to make sure that we're resilient across those sectors. So that's very much about that's what the National Adaptation Programme does. But to flesh that out, we are running workshops on droughts, on wildfires, on extreme heat events, on floods, just so that we are thinking ahead.
These are still one-off events. I'm trying to get some examples about the long term. And maybe then I could ask Mr. Martin, how do you look at risk? Because the most obvious way is looking at the one-offs or the short terms, as opposed to the much longer term, if you like, strategic risk. How do you look at that sort of risk to ensure that government is better prepared and devotes enough time to looking at that rather than just the reactive response to the one-off events?
Mr. Martin.
More generally, as part of the risk management strategy that we've been delivering, we are seeking to enrich the way in which risk is considered in decisions. So the chances of different degrees of success or failure in relation to programmes, policies, brings into play that aspect of variability. And when you're dealing then with the variability, you can look at the different time frames involved. One of the most significant developments, I think, from my colleagues in the last 18 months or so has been the split of the civil contingencies unit into a unit looking at the shorter term, more acute impacts, and Dr. Clarke's area, which looks more at the chronic exposures arising from these risks.
Okay, chronic exposure. I like the word chronic, but it still sounded to me a bit reactive and short term. So far, I think we're on to the third report from the Climate Change Committee on adaptation, and I have yet to see much that convinces me. We really have thought about what is it we need to put in place, given we're predicting where climate's going to take us, to make sure that society works in a way which is appropriate, which is more than what Ms. Finkelstein's doing. I mean, what you're doing is brilliant. What about everybody else?
I mean, I probably should, however, I have some responsibilities across the wider piece that I should fess up to, because you described that the work that we do on mitigation, which the Department of Energy, Security Climate Change, but they net zero, they had that responsibility. How are we responding on mitigating climate change? DEFRA leads on exactly what you're describing, which is how are we adapting to climate change. So what we do is at the beginning of 2022 we did, well, what is the UK's climate change risk assessment that we need to ensure that we are adapting against. Actually, we get the Climate Change Committee to do that for us, but it's actually owned, the government has it. We then have that risk assessment. We then spend the time from then till when we published this programme in 2023, in the middle of 2023, where we work, and it's led by DEFRA, but it's a whole of government effort, and say we've got these 61 risks out of this risk assessment, half of them our own are DEFRA ones that we have to deal with, but the rest, as you describe, are right across government. What actions are we going to take to deal with these risks, which are, as you say, long-running risks, out of which we've got a programme with over sort of 500 actions of things that we do. Now, in some of the areas I own, they are things like the big flood defence programme, but you know, there are also things for heat, about what are we going to do about our buildings and how we build them to be appropriate for extremes of heat. So we have those, and what we are doing then is assessing, well, how are we doing against those actions, and developing the right indicators to see how we're doing against them. So it is a big whole of government approach. One of the things we did and committed to in the programme is that we'd work with the Cabinet Office, because that helps us to get this leverage right across government. And Dr. Clarke talked about the committee that he jointly chairs with DEFRA, that brings everyone in, including the Treasury, because it's totally critical that we fund these things. So that's what we've got in place.
Ms. Finkelstein, I hear what you say,
yes,
but even in the NAA report, it's clear there is a great concern that there is no focused government goal on what you're trying to achieve to deal with this adaptation piece. And I think unless you have goals, you're certainly not going to be able to achieve them, and you will not be able to measure whether or not you've succeeded or not. My concern is, you're right, there are some things outside DEFRA. You've been looking at what you do about managing heat in homes. There are a number of discrete things, but you've not looked at holistically at how do people live their lives. What is it we're going to have to change in the way we live our lives? What's going on in the other government departments? There's a bit about health, but dealing with the increasing number of people who with heat stroke going into hospital isn't going to cut it. So I think my ask is, what more are you going to do? Because it shouldn't be DEFRA being 50%. Actually, you should be about 20%.
When you look at the risks, a lot of them end up being quite significant environmental risks of that kind. That's why. But it is absolutely wide-ranging. I mean, I think we do have a clear vision. What do we want to do? We want to be able to be a country that plans for and adapts to climate change.
Not a goal.
And resilience against each of those risks. No, so that's what we planned against. We planned against managing all those risks. We are doing more to go, well, how do we, what are we measuring overall in terms of our levels of resilience? So we are doing some more work on that measurement to improve it. And Dr. Clarke will be able to give some more information on what we are doing. I would not pretend that we are doing everything that we need to do. So there is a lot more to do, but we've taken a huge step forward in identifying what needs to be done. And some of them are about how we work with the public. Actually, some of what what we've got to do on adapting to drought is around how much water we use and getting to 110 litres a day from 140 litres a day. So that there are things which are very much about how you engage the public, and there are ways in which we're looking to involve the public more in understanding more about what resilience means and various things which you're building in your area.
Can I come back just once?
By all means.
Yeah, Dr. Clarke, I've been misdescribing you. If you've earned your doctorate, you should be.
I just wanted to mention also the chronic risks work which we are taking forward. So in an extension of the National Security Risk Assessment, the National Risk Register, which is the thing that we publish and is there for everyone to look at, and businesses can make rational decisions based upon the risks they see. We are extending that product into chronic risks as well, so exactly like adaptation, thinking about those risks that will be here in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and what effects will we see on the back of those. So not just the preventing those things in the first place, which is the climate change policy, but really how do we adapt? So how will buildings need to adapt? What does it mean for healthcare? Looking at all these dimensions, and in the same way that National Security Risk Assessment has panels of experts, we will get panels of experts together to develop further this chronic risks work, and that way it really is embedding itself in departments. So it's even beyond the National Adaptation Programme. It's thinking at longer timescales, and really in any policy that people are doing across government, they're going to want to be thinking adaptation, and that's what the purpose of this work is, to really give them the data that they need, the thinking that they need, to empower them effectively from the Cabinet Office across government to be thinking in this way, and that's what we're trying to embed now.
I think it's a bigger problem than that, but let's leave it there, Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
I've been listening to this discussion, and I just don't really think we're talking too much in sort of generalities, how we deal with risk. And it seems to me that it revolves, and I'm sorry if this is too simplistic, and I don't mind which of you answers this question, but it seems to me that it revolves around 3 Ps: preventing, planning, and proactivity. Preventing would be certainly to do with adaptation. Planning would certainly be to do with resilience, and proactivity is emergency measures once it's happened. Now, it seemed to me that if you take COVID, we were very much in the right hand of those emergency measures once it's happened. I am getting from this discussion too much of we're thinking about the emergency measures once it's happened, and not enough about how we prevent the thing in the first place. Miss Marie Morris's questions on adaptation certainly comes into that category. So can you reassure me that I'm wrong and that we are doing more to think about prevention?
I think it's worth saying that we are in the business of disruptive events. We're in the business of disruptive events, so those moments where the demands on government accelerate very fast. And I'm looking at the immediate operational response to those and kind of a 6-month out time frame. And the head of resilience is looking at longer timeframes, but still about building capabilities in relation to disruptive events. There is an important point of transition as you go further and further into the future, where planning for disruptive events runs into planning for broader policy challenges. So we are not the be-all and end-all of the government's work around extreme weather or adaptation more generally. We are one part of a system for responding to it.
Great respect, Mr. Hargreaves. You've just played straight into my analysis. You're saying that you're thinking about emergency measures of how to deal with it once it's happened. Mr. Martin, you know I'm very keen on the government having a chief risk officer. We don't want to rehearse that all again, but I am not sure that I'm getting from this discussion that there is enough going on around the prevention part of those 3 Ps.
We have to take...
I'll bring Mr. Martin, because Mr. Martin, we really, your oversight on risk is what we're really after, I think.
Okay.
What could be being done better?
We have to take good risks in pursuit of opportunity. So prevention will always be, needs to be economic prevention, however we decide to measure that. More broadly, the risk management strategy that I've been focused on implementing involves improving the risk management capability of government, and that can apply to any aspect of riskiness. It involves increasing the professionalism and the credibility of all of those involved, and it includes increasing cross-boundary working. All of those things will help on any aspect of risk, whether it's pre-event work done for prevention purposes or pre-event work done for a post-event type of scenario. So one of the things we've been producing is a suite of toolkits, and we do it in collaboration with a department and then make it available to everyone. So it's a faster way of doing things. One of the toolkits we produced in the last year in collaboration with the department is a risk scenario planning toolkit. And we've worked with the Resilience Directorate's activity going on with Go Science to make sure that we've got a cohesive set of tools that are available to departments. And so ours is sort of practical, pragmatic in terms of leveraging from financial services capabilities, thinking about what we might need to do now to either avoid or deal with longer term impacts. And that fits with the more higher level stuff that Dr. Clarke was talking about earlier on, with big themes and systemic shifts in people and movements that may need to occur. So through those toolkits and through the other work we are doing, which I can detail if you would like me to, I think we are making improvements in that space.
Dr. Clarke, do you want to come in on?
I would just say one thing briefly, and that's, apologies if I've not made the whole purpose of the Resilience Directorate clear. I talked about 3 legs of the stool, 3 fundamental principles of the reason for setting up the Resilience Directorate. The first of which, as I said, is around a shared understanding of the risk, so thinking ahead, being prepared. The second is that prevention is better than cure, so if things go wrong, if there needs to be a response activity, that's very much for Roger, Mr. Hargreaves, and the outfit he runs across government as well. So, and the third one is that it's the whole of society business doing resilience, but heavily encoded into the work that I do, one of the 3 key fundamental principles is that prevention is better than cure, and that's why we have all of the activities that we have been putting in place.
Really helpful answer. Can I take you to paragraph 9? And I've got a bit of experience about what I'm about to ask you. In the whole of the BSE crisis, we used to have emergency meetings every day of about 30 people sitting around a huge government table. Net result of any of those meetings, nobody knew what they were supposed to do, because everybody had chipped in with their little bit and there was no overall strategy. So, and the BSE crisis was a very serious crisis. You were a long way from DEFRA at the time, Ms. Finkelstein, but there was a proposal that during that whole crisis that every single beast in this country was going to be slaughtered. So I take you to paragraph 9 and just look at the list of bodies and committees that are involved, rather going back to that BSE crisis, and I've highlighted them. The National Situation Centre to bring in data, a resilience director, COBR, which we all know about, a resilience subcommittee of the National Security Council, resilience forum. The Cabinet also appointed a head of resilience, the Treasury Climate Resilience Board. It seems to me that there's far too many people involved, and if there are too many people involved, they're all shuffling off responsibility to one another, which is exactly what happened in the BSE crisis. It seems to me that you need a simple system so that everybody knows in a given emergency who is doing what.
I think that what you've got there is a list of organisations that play a role on a whole range of risks, and both in the preparatory phase and in the response phase. Response to emergencies is run in a much more streamlined form. You have the COBRA committee, which brings together ministers or officials, and that is supported by my unit, the National Situation Centre, services us in respect of data. It's a very transformative change that we've introduced over the last 2 years. Ministers gather, they make decisions, and they do it in a much more streamlined way than they would do ordinarily in cabinet committees or cabinet itself, though it has all of the authority of those committees. So it's a very clear system in practice. The other organisations, for example, NSCR, the Resilience Ministerial Committee, is for effectively peacetime planning. So of your three, the proactivity bit is clear, and some of those things relate to the proactivity bit, but the planning task is done through the other structures. They're different in design, and that's why we use different things for different jobs.
One other question from me, Dr. Clarke, and maybe you want to come in on this, Mr. Hargreaves. I've always been a little worried this emergency planning is not thinking about the really big events. And now, with extremes of weather and other things that one could think about, the really big event has to be a possibility. Just let me tell you, for example, if the Thames Barrier failed, the consequences of that. Is your planning team really thinking about those big events?
We plan for a range, to operationalise a response to a range of events up and to including the most extreme, including events on a larger scale than that.
Yeah. And if I may add on the back of that, the exercise I talked about earlier, national power outage, that is exactly one of those sorts of risks that we plan for, we exercise for. Clearly we seek to prevent as well. But if it happens, then the exercising, the planning, the prevention helps.
So one other question. In all of this, and it nearly happened in Gloucester during one of the floods, the major substation was about to be overwhelmed. So this gives the basis for my next question. If it wasn't for the efforts of the army bringing in masses of sandbags to prevent that substation being flooded, 500 people would have been without power within hours. So what role do the armed forces play in your planning?
They provide a variety of different capabilities. We effectively call on them as necessary if we require any of the effects that they've got on offer. They have 3 standby battalions, they have a range of specialist capabilities, we've got a series of standing operations that we can call in. So in that instance, in 2007, we were able to call on standby battalions. We did again for example, Storm Arwen. So it works.
Sorry, if I didn't make the question quite clear, Mr. Hargreaves, what I was trying to get at is all very well calling on all those excellent people once the event has happened, but are they involved in the planning so that they know how to gear up their resources to deal with any possible scenario?
Yes, I mean they sit on all of our planning committees, and some of that is the sort of longer term capability building stuff that Dr. Clarke does. But in my arena, as we see risks emerging, they will be heavily involved as necessary in the planning phase. I have a military liaison team that report to me and provide a very clear link. We're incredibly well connected into the Ministry of Defence.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. Olivia Blake, MP.
Thank you, Chair. And just to pick up on some of what we've been saying about the kind of approach around whole system risks and how confident you are, Mr. Clarke, I suppose, in that the right action has been taken across all areas of government to manage whole system risks.
Yeah. I am confident that we have a very good programme of work in place framed by the resilience framework, and we have spent the last 18 months putting in place those really foundational products, so really thinking about as I say, the National Security Risk Assessment, the capabilities assessment, I have been leading some work on critical national infrastructure and looking at the interdependencies between them, so that if one piece of infrastructure is affected, you can see what the knock-on impact might be as well. So I think we have made a very good start. Clearly there is still further to go, and I've talked about some of those things that will be coming in terms of the risk survey, the public risk survey, the public website, the volunteering index, so that the voluntary community and people can connect there as well. So I'm confident we've got a good, collectively agreed programme of work in place, but of course there's always more to do in this area.
Follow up on some of the conversation we were just having. Why is there not a government chief risk advisor like the National Security Advisor? And do you believe that if there was one, that would provide a more cohesive, system-wide view and leadership actually in this space?
I am the Chief Resilience Officer. I'm Head of Resilience, and I have all of the means at my disposal, and very keen Deputy Prime Minister who chairs the National Security Council Resilience, which oversees this area. I report to the Deputy National Security Advisor and the Head of the Economic and Domestic Secretariat, the Minister for the Cabinet Office as well. So I effectively look at that system that assesses the risks and makes sure that we are prepared. That is, I think, what the intent of the NAO's recommendation is on this Chief Risk Officer. And at the broader sense of that Chief Risk Officer, I know that's a matter that has been debated at fair length, including with the Chief Operating Officer of the Civil Service has been talking about this too. I know Clive may want to come in on this too. Sorry, Mr. Martin. But yeah, I mean, I fulfil that role, which is really looking at all of these resilience risks across government and making sure there's a robust system in place to be prepared for them.
On your shoulders.
Yep.
Do you think there'd be any advantage to having an extra role?
There was a single role, which was the head of the Civil Contingency Secretariat, that covered both the response and the longer term planning, and we split it precisely to create a head of resilience role separate from the response role.
And that means that the resources can be focused both on the near term and the response, and then that longer term chronic risks, embedding ourselves in wider policy, which are some of the points made today. It allows that separation and the resources to be focused on those areas.
Did you have any comment on that question?
I'd agree with what Dr. Clarke is saying in relation to this area of risk. We're talking about civil contingency risk here for the most part, but of course there are other aspects of risk and riskiness that government needs to grapple with day in, day out. There are circumstances and events which affect the broader risk landscape. So it's not just about civil contingencies. It's about the extent to which various risks can impact the chances of different degrees of success or failure in government policy, on programmes and items like that. There's the work of the Public Sector Fraud Authority. There's the work of the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. They're all focused on helping manage aspects of risk as well. The arguments for an overall Chief Risk Advisor seem to relate largely to the level of challenge, or the desire for more challenge of government. The arguments against tend to point to the scale of the subject matter and the possibility that if you do appoint someone, others who actually have responsibility for risk may feel less responsible for it. I think both sides of those arguments have good merit. So my challenge has been, how do you take that forward? And so we've been doing work to get more to the substance of what such a role would consist of, and point to the many places in government where that is already happening. And so partly from a prompt from the Public Accounts Committee, we undertook some work to set out the different contributions that different units make to the management of risk. And we did that at quite a detailed level because we think it's important. The detail is important. That's where you can see this cohesion. That's where you can understand how they link to each other. And I think that holds the key really to make more progress in this.
I'm just curious about whether or not there's a role with, and this is no disrespect meant at all, with significant enough kind of leadership level to not just deal with contingency risks and resilience, but also consequential risks and the risks that you've kind of just outlined there a bit, Mr. Martin. And if you're confident that the system as it is robust enough, or if there is a need for an additional role. Sorry to push on this.
I have got a lot of comfort from the work done on civil contingencies that we've been describing and the effort that's been made. More broadly, this is work in progress as we try to work through all the ways in which we can bring continual improvement to the way in which government manages risk. So if we were to have one, for example, one of the things we've considered is what level should that be and who would they be challenging, given the governance structures that we have in government, because they need to work with it. Yeah. Often in the private sector, a chief risk officer might be of a comparable grade to a chief financial officer. Yeah. So when you pose the question, who's the chief financial officer in government then, some people will say, well, that's a ministerial role, that's the Chancellor. Others will say, no, it's the head of the government finance function. Others may have other actions. So depending on how we look at that, I think that that creates the opportunity for thinking about chief risk officer either as a civil servant or maybe even as some form of ministerial role, if we think that is the sort of work necessary. And that's all subject to thinking about legalities and all of this, which we haven't managed to get to yet.
I think the legalities could be sorted if the principal is agreed, but I just want to bring in Ms. Finkelstein here.
I suppose just saying about how it feels playing out, especially being a sort of lead government department for some of the risks, which is that the whole area has been kind of raised in its importance by the Chief Operating Officer for the Civil Service and actually by the head of the government finance profession that Mr. Martin works to, and between them, the key roles here all report into the two of them. So they are at the most sort of senior levels and bring that to the attention of the set of permanent secretaries, the Civil Service Board, in which they both are. So because it'd be quite hard, quite how you compartmentalise the role that is described, whereas the set of roles that we have, the role that Mr. Martin plays, which builds very much our kind of professional capability in the way we deal with risk in departments. Dr. Clarke, who has brought this kind of resilience directorate together, which provides an absolute focus on the national security risk assessment and how we kind of deal with those risks, and then having the civil contingencies secretariat, they come under those two most senior people. So that's how it plays out. So whether another role in the mix would help, I'm a little bit less convinced. Partly because I do think as a permanent secretary of a department holding some of those risks, managing those is for me and my executive board, a lot of it, while feeding into this cross-cutting view. So that's how it feels sitting in that role.
We may disagree, but we won't get into that.
We have quite a view on this committee.
Yes.
But we're seeing how happens in this.
I guess moving on to funding then, and this links quite strongly, I think. Who and how are decisions taken and made on what gets spent and what's the prioritisation across government on this? And I think we've had a bit of a lack of conversation about preparedness and prevention. So if you could pick up some of those themes, that would be very helpful. I don't know who wants to take that.
I can certainly start.
Dr. Clarke.
Yeah, happy to. So there will be different risks that need action taken for them, and quite often those will be within departments, and therefore it's right that, you know, kind of the accounting officer and the structures that sit beneath them are making those decisions about what gets funded in the department. As I mentioned earlier, we do clearly have an interest in making sure we get kind of a coherent framework for resilience across government, and in particular we work closely with the Treasury, because there will be trade-offs to be made when we're looking in the round, and money spent in one area might be better spent in another area because it reduces the risk more, but that's where the conversation comes in, and where collectively around the National Security Council Resilience Table, for example, those different views will be input. We, as I say, we are working with the Treasury on how we can use the data that we have amassed across the resilience system to set out where the gaps are, when the vulnerabilities are, where we think it's best directing the money, and we're part of those conversations across departments as well, and it's our role as the Resilience Directorate to bring that conversation together with the Treasury so that there's best value for money and best risk reduction. The £10 million fund I mentioned, just to reference it again, I mean, the Treasury, the Chancellor in the autumn statement did announce this £10 million fund to really get to the root of this. So really, what are the different risks that we need to understand, what are the vulnerabilities that we need to look at, what data do we need to inform that, and that £10 million fund will be directed to answering some of the questions you've been asking.
And on the kind of longer term hope that you'd have a coordinated, prioritised approach to investment, and I think it's 2030 that's the aim for that, isn't it? I noticed that NAO have recommended that being brought forward.
Yes.
Why has that number been put so far in the future, given the increase?
I think it comes down, like I said earlier, it's not a target date, but it's an end point, so that we have a programme of work. But if we can meet it sooner, if we can do the work that identifies the vulnerabilities, and we can come up with the solutions to those across government, and therefore, you know, kind of direct the spend in that way, then that's what we will do sooner. And for example, I know that the National Infrastructure Commission would like standards where those are important for the system as well in place much sooner. And we're not holding them back, we're working with them. There will be a series of workshops over the next few months to really get into where is that effort best directed, what are the targets, the goals, and the standards that then underpin that system as well.
And just looping back a bit about prioritisation, and you kind of discussed the trade-offs that may or may not exist and things that have to be done. How is risk used to make sure that those investments and the trade-off before the short-term and the longer-term investments in resilience are the right ones?
Yep.
Because you can make tough decisions, but you need, how are you assured that the tough decision is the right decision given the risks that you're facing?
It's all about the evidence and the data, and adhering with you know, good Treasury products like the Orange Book, which talk about the treatment of risks. So making sure that we are running a system which provides that evidence. We have the governance and the forums which can bring together those cross-cutting conversations, and therefore we can talk about where those trade-offs are. And sometimes it will be preventative activities, and sometimes it will be response activities. But that's the conversation that Mr. Hargreaves and I have as well.
And given the partners that you have to work with to deal with some of these big consequences, and local government funding in particular has been quite restrained over the last few years, how confident are you that government can direct the funding to the right places when managing these risks across the board?
Having the right conversations, I should say, and you know, the local areas are not at all forgotten. I mentioned the local resilience forums and the money that has been pointed in that direction, and the local resilience forum pilots, which will really strengthen the approach in LRFs as well. So all I can say is that we're having the right conversations. We have the Deputy Prime Minister in particular, and the Minister for the Cabinet Office, very, very keen champions for this resilience work that we're doing, and the Deputy Prime Minister convenes that Cabinet Committee that discusses exactly these sorts of things.
Yeah. Have you kind of done any assessment on how much it would save you to invest now rather than having to pay out in bellwin consequences? Is that the right phrase?
So the return on investment for resilience,
especially in, you know, like let's take Hull for example. You know, predicted to be underwater by 2050 if we're not careful. You know, if they, as a local authority, are consistently having to deal with flooding from both sides, you know, that's going to have an impact. So how are you going to make sure that they're going to be able to deliver on that continuing basis? Because it's not just going to hit randomly, is it? There's going to be communities that are hit
there's lots of analysis. Sorry. There's lots of analysis in the area that shows the return on investment for investing in resilience effectively versus dealing with the consequences down the line. It's usually a positive return, or in many cases anyway, but it's very specific to the risk we're talking about. If it's a particular flood defence, for example, or if it's a national capability. But that return on investment is really key to us, and one of the messages that we really want to get out alongside the resilience framework is that people should be investing in that resilience. The return on investment can be good, and you need the evidence base and the data to underpin that approach as well. And it's also complementary to productivity, it's complementary to growth. It means that businesses can focus on generating the profits, you know, rather than kind of fighting the fires and dealing with the issues. So that's an argument which we're really keen to get across as well, as we try to build this resilient approach across the whole of society, including in business. We're working with the insurance industry as well, who's helping us to underpin the figures on what it costs to deal with the issue versus investing ahead of the issue.
Just observe that we shouldn't sort of sugarcoat where we are in terms of the resourcing here. I think, you know, if you look at funding for local authorities or the way they spend money on resilience, it has fallen. If you look at the pressures on, you know, public spending generally, but the way we feel those pressures, now, if we think of this as an insurance policy, we've pretty much pared it back to third party and that's it. But if you want to spend more on this, you have to accept two things. One, there is a risk that you'll spend on the wrong items, because we are in the game of predicting the future around really, really kind of marginal, low likelihood risks. So there is a prospect that we will suggest investment in something that simply never happens. And so there needs to be a kind of collective official and ministerial will that sometimes you will spend money and it doesn't come to anything. Give us an example? Well, if, for example, we had spent money every year, say we'd spent £5 billion every year for the last 20 years on pandemic preparedness. At some point, we may well have found ourselves in front of this committee or a different committee or an internal body explaining why so much money was going out of the door for something that wasn't going to happen. Then it happens, and it looks like a great investment. But that's pandemics, which is quite high likelihood compared to a lot of our other risks. Others of them are more marginal. There are some areas where it's easier. So if you look
it's about all the risk, how our government assesses risk appetite.
Yeah, but there are some areas where it's easier, like flood risk, where there's a kind of much clearer pattern of analysis around returns on investment around flood defence. But others are much harder to assess in terms of likelihood. The other difficulty is if you want to spend more money, there may be hard choices about where it comes from because you're choosing not to spend on other activities which might be more important. So, you know, I recently went to Finland to kind of do a bit of compare and contrast around their work. They put a levy on people's energy bills to pay for aspects of resilience. If we want to do that, you know, given a broader debate about energy bills and the way they fall on people, that's a really hard political choice if we were to copy that model. And I'm not suggesting we would, but it's an example of spending on resilience, taking for things that might happen, taking away from spending on things that you know will happen, and that requires a certain kind of political debate at large. That's not a kind of part.
We appreciate some of this definitely falls to politicians. Ms. Blake.
Final question then, because I guess as time goes on, innovations will come about. How does our risk appetite in the UK fit with having innovative responses to resilience?
I think a really good example of that, certainly from where I'm sitting, is our operational capabilities around wildfire.
Do we want to be innovative, or do we want to just be safer than safe?
Well, I think these kind of extreme weather risks are a really good example of that, where we have to be innovative, because the thing about the nature of the challenge around climate change is there are lots of different pathways it might take, and even if we can be clear that some problems will be more significant, exactly how they manifest is something that everyone is uncertain about to a degree, so you have to be flexible. If you look at our work around wildfires, that's really moved on over the last 5 years. We've had some very significant wildfire events, very significant fire on Saddleworth Moor, which for a variety of technical reasons was kind of quite groundbreaking. We've had an increase in wildfire events. We had some very high profile ones on the edges of London 18 months or so ago. As a consequence of that, The fire service have built their operational tactics. We have shifted the way in which we describe it within our risk assessments and the capabilities we expect. The Home Office are developing, on behalf of the whole of government, a revised wildfire strategy to reflect the new challenges. We have developed our public warning and informing arrangements around wildfires and extreme heat. So over the last 5 years, we have adapted our system to manage the shifting task around extreme weather. So I think that's a really good example of how we have done that. And I think climate change and the challenges in relation to it that manifest as extreme weather will test us again and again on that front.
Thank you very much, Ms. Blake. Jonathan Knogley.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just looking at the NAO report, paragraph 24, and it says, we found limited evidence that government tests and assures contingency plans. So, Mr. Martin and perhaps Mr. Clarke, is that a fair assessment? And how is the government going to assure that contingency plans are effective in the wider public sector and also the private sector?
Probably one for me.
Okay,
I think, yeah. So we do regular testing of contingency plans. There are different forms in which that occurs. So as risks or as risk pathways start to develop, so we can see things coming towards us, my unit effectively calls in departmental plans to look at how robust they are and work with those departments to develop them as necessary. We test them against standardised models for delivery of effective response. We also run exercising programmes. Some of that is longer term. Others are conducted on a much more short-term basis focused on emerging risks, and we have specific exercising models which are quite unique that we use to deliver that. So we are continuously testing a whole variety of risks, and that intensifies as the risk pathways open up. In terms of flooding, weather and so forth, we've run a series of flood exercises and other severe weather exercises through the autumn, and they've been very helpful in terms of being effective in responding to events that we've seen over the last 3 months. And we've also run lessons learned exercises which retrospectively reflect on what's been experienced and see whether there are any lessons. And again, we've run those feedback loops even within this present weather season.
So if you're doing all of that, why did the NAO find limited evidence that you're doing tests Is it because what you told me is still a minuscule amount in the context of the whole?
The NAO would have to comment on that. I think my view.
You're disagreeing with NAO's position there.
On this point, I don't recognise that statement as a fair one. No.
Okay.
An agreed report. Bring in Sian Jones.
Can I come in? So it's true, as you say, paragraph 24, we said that there were limited evidence that government tests and assures contingency plans. This was cleared by the Cabinet Office.
And it was by the Accounting Officer, Alex Chisholm.
And the response that we had was that the Cabinet Office felt that it was impractical to review and test all plans. So that was acknowledged during field work, and that was the response that we received.
I'm still trying to weigh that up with what Mr. Hargreaves has just said.
It may just be there's a difference about the intensity of the work required, but I'm describing to you a whole series of events that we've done in relation to the risks that we're talking about here. The broader point about the level of exercising, how much exercising we do across the full range of 100 risks in the National Security Risk Assessment, well, undoubtedly it's the case that some of those risks will be exercised less. But severe weather is one of our most active areas of business and one of our real examples of success in terms of preparedness and capacity.
Yeah, how many plans do you review?
How many do we
review?
So we would, on a 6-monthly basis, tend to call in off a list of about 35.
Out of the 100, so the top 35.
Yeah, so in sort of broad terms, there are about 100 risks in the NSRA. But that's a kind of 2 to 5 year time frame.
Yeah.
We then run a forward look process which looks at emerging risks up to 6 months out, and that kind of gets down selected to about 35. We then work with departments on those 35.
This is all the ones that are in short term. This is the reactive stuff, things that are 6 months.
I mean, that's my business. I mean, there's separate work.
National exercising programme on my side, which looks ahead 5 years.
How many do you look at there then? In the longer, Dr. Clarke, how many do you look at in the longer term then?
I mean, dozens and dozens of them. It's
every year. How many? So in this year, how
many have we exercised on longer term plans?
Yeah.
I mean, it will be similar to the number that's being looked at from the response perspective, because when we're running an exercise, it's very much around how prepared are you, how do you respond when the thing happens, and that's what you're testing here.
So again, short term, not looking longer term.
We're testing plans all the time, but in terms of exercising, it's very much around a situation unfolds, how set up is
so the
system.
exercises are in the same sort of time, well, a bit further out than Mr. Hargreaves' exercise work.
Yeah, because he's looking at a 6-month window. I'm looking beyond.
And this may be an issue that we want to look into further after today. But I mean, just thinking back to Ms. Blake's line. So the NEO report is saying that there's no coordinated approach to investment in resilience now, and won't be until possibly 2030. And we have this issue of limited evidence that existing contingency plans are being tested. And it just seems to me that this is a big issue. Mr. Hargreaves, am I wrong?
My view is we are calling in plans from departments in relation to emerging events continuously. Severe weather is undoubtedly our busiest area and where we are most active, both in terms of exercising and in terms of calling in plans and in terms of response. So from where I sit, it is one of our real exemplars of effective behaviour, but that's in part driven by the fact that it's such a common risk. If we had much greater resources, we would have a more ambitious national exercising programme that looked at risks further in advance of need.
What would those, when you say more resources, what does that mean?
Every time you run a Tier 1 national exercise of the kind that we saw with Mighty Oak, you are in the realms of £500,000 per exercise. It is a 3-day exercise, so it takes pretty much everyone who works in the field of resilience out for at least 3 days and probably more, plus there's a large sort of planning phase too. Realistically, the system will bear perhaps 3 or 4 of those exercises a year, and at present we don't.
Can I just say that Westminster Council used to war game AB teams every fortnight. I don't know if they still do, but that's okay. That's at a not your level, but is there more exercises going on anywhere else in government?
Yeah, we do. I mean, we do a lot of exercises around our risks as they emerge to make sure people are match fit effectively for emergent risks. Then you've got exercises that take place within departments. And many
so they're there in addition. Okay, just be clear.
And then all of the ones at a local level. What we're talking here about is Tier 1 national exercises.
Okay, that's just to be clear. Okay.
I just wanted to reference again the national exercising programme. So there's the Tier 1 exercises, but then I would be surprised if every week there isn't an exercise happening somewhere in the system that we're talking about, testing different aspects. No. But the real value add, if you like, from the national exercising programme is not only does it just capture those first off and provides a mechanism for embedding best practice in exercising, but actually what it is doing over time is making sure that those exercises are focused on the things that we have identified that there is a need to exercise because there may be a gap or a vulnerability or a system needs to work together and build those relationships. So that's the value of this 5-year forward look, to really add the value on this as well as the kind of the responsive stuff.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jogley. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Yes, perhaps Dr. Clarke. Sorry, I don't want to perpetuate that. We all acknowledge your doctorate, so that's all right. Could I take you to paragraph 3.2 on page 39? And the relevant bit I want to quote, and we're not normally quoting out bits of the report because we assume everybody's read it, but I think this is so strong that I think it's important that it is on the record. For 3 of the 4 extreme weather events we examined, all except drought, there was a lack of clarity on what outcome government is looking to achieve, such as target levels of preparedness, resilience, and an agreement on the level of tolerable risk based on a well-informed risk appetite. And this is the really important sentence. Without these, it's impossible for government to identify the actions needed to evaluate progress. How do you react to that? That's pretty strong speak for the NAO and you've agreed there's wording. It's pretty strong speak. What is your response to that? Please?
Very, very much like the standard, if you like, that's put in here around a 1 in 200 year severe drought impact, that is exactly the work that we are working with organisations like the National Infrastructure Commission to work out what are the relevant standards that we should be working towards. But as I said, there's a wider set of targets and outcomes and a regulatory framework that sometimes there will be regulatory standards to meet service continuity like that. Sometimes they will be hard-coded into legislation as well, and there'll be sort of government powers that sit behind those. I think it's really, really important that we get this right based on the right evidence. So whilst I would love to say that across all of the different risks here, we can pin it down to you must be ready for a 1 in X year event, or if it does go down, you should be able to recover in X number of hours or days. We just need the evidence base to really underpin the approach, because there will be costs. We want the right outcomes that we're seeking here as well, and we're doing that foundational work to make sure we're there.
I acknowledge your willingness to want to try and achieve this, but over what sort of timetable are we looking at?
2030 is in the resilience framework, but as I said, that's a backstop, and what we're not doing is holding up other risk-owning departments taking forward their own plans. Our desire would be that this is coherent and as outcome-focused as we can make it. So we're not holding anyone back who wants to do it sooner. We are working with those departments just to check that it does all hang together, because what you don't want is an unintended impact because you're doing something, I don't know, let's say on cyber security, which then is not taking into mind some other capability that's needed in a department. So that's the bigger picture we're bringing to this conversation.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Penelope, Sir Geoffrey. Back to Olivia Blake MP.
Thank you, Chair. And these questions are about extreme weather events, and I'd be very grateful if Professor Endersby could answer the question, which are the extreme weather events that we're facing where the potential impacts are the least understood for the UK?
Of course. So I would start by saying that, as Dr. Clarke already mentioned, extreme weather is actually one of the events where we're most frequently dealing with it, and it is well understood because they're events that we see regularly and deal with. Inevitably, the ones that we understand least well are the ones we haven't seen yet, so the unprecedented ones, and those tend to be linked to climate change. And I think the report makes a very fair point about the extreme heat in 2022, that there were impacts that we absolutely anticipated, the health ones, the infrastructure ones, and then there were some areas where the impacts were probably worse than we anticipated, as might be the wildfires and also the cold shock deaths of young men, particularly jumping into cold water and dying unnecessarily, of not drowning, but of the cold. So the other one I would draw out in terms of climate change and its impacts on the UK, we are absolutely expecting, as you would know, the hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters, more intense rainfall in summer when we do see it. And while I think the 2022 heat event was pretty close to a reasonable worst case for what we can expect in today's climate, the one we know we have not seen is the extreme heavy rainfall, what we describe as convective rainfall, and the consequent localised surface water flooding. And we know we've seen those events in neighbouring countries, so Germany and Belgium had an atrocious example. We've seen them on a relatively smaller scale in the UK, and so trying to get ahead of that is the area where it's probably less well characterised.
You talk about a smaller scale. Can you just explain to make it so we can visualise it, what it would
absolutely
look like on a larger scale?
Yeah. So if you if you think about what happened in Germany and Belgium, it was just overwhelming of catchments and flooding on, I think that might have been more river flooding, but very heavy rainfall in a localised area, worse in an urban area, both because of population and because they can't drain away so easily. It's the difference between, if you get a big storm, you can see it come across the map, you see it in our forecasts and again in the radar, and it might cover a third of the UK when it goes through. This kind of event where you get thundery downpours, it looks more like the map's got measles and we're trying to project exactly where a spot's going to be, and the extreme impacts depend exactly where the spot is. That's harder for us to forecast, harder to give much notice, and therefore it puts more of a stress on the whole response system because they don't get so much warning for how to respond.
it's a good visualisation, just helps us to get it in our heads. Ms. Blake.
What do you think government should be doing to gain a better understanding of the impact of such events? What practical things would help?
So there's a lot that we already are doing, and I should say that all of our ability to predict those impacts is built on our national capability to forecast weather and climate. So there's a big investment already goes into that, and in particular the Hadley Centre Climate Programme, where we do the research, which then manifests itself through things like the UK climate projections, which DEFRA fund for us, which gives you what extremes you might expect on a sort of 2-kilometre grid across the UK. The other thing that we can and do is look at where partner nations already experience those events and learn from those. Wildfire is a great example of that, where we anticipate that could be a rising risk in the UK, but there's many countries who deal with it routinely: Australia, Canada, France, and we look at what they already do to characterise our national systems.
And how is the government learning from other countries about the impacts of the extreme weather risks, but also what they can do to mitigate the risks? And how...
So I just gave you one example, actually. So our fire severity index was built on the Canadian one, because that's a country where they already experience those things. But from our point of view, we operate very much as a leading nation within the World Meteorological Organization. So we help many nations establish what good practice looks like in responding to severe weather and climate impacts. And then with partner nations, there's so many examples I could give. I think I'll pick on one and then you can ask me for more. So our weather model, which all our forecasting is built on, our unified model, it's a UK model, but actually there's a number of other nations that partner with us and use it. India, Korea, Australia, Singapore, the US Air Force, they all use it. There's a number of others. They pay us something for its use, but their biggest contribution is in kind. So they help us develop that model, and they do that with their own expertise about severe weather they experience in their countries. So tropical cyclones, Korea are very good at modelling, as you might expect, and that's fed back into the model we all use and improves that performance for all of us. So that's one good example. I could pick on others around volcanic ash or surface water flooding, but I'll let you come back if you want more.
That's helpful. I've just got a final question, and it's about figure 4, and I just found it very interesting that there was nothing identified that was either deemed catastrophic or more than 25%. And
can you point me to a page, please?
Page 25. It's just the government's national assessment of extreme weather risks, and I just wondered if that framework needs adjusting slightly to zoom in a bit more, or if you're comfortable with that.
So I think we had lots of opportunity to feed into these risks through the national, the national risk assessment process, and those are well characterised levels. So I think that probably if we thought there should have been somewhere else, we'd have fed that in at the time. That's compared with, I guess, nuclear disaster or the total power system going down for the UK, there are even worse things that can happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's a system which covers a longer list of risks, some of which push further into these categories. The one that's most difficult is the likelihood one, because these are quite hard events to predict. But in terms of the material that then flows from it, you've got a detailed scenario against which you plan, key assumptions about the capabilities that you need, and effectively derive from that as a list of operational activity that you need to create. There are descriptions of variations, so different scenarios, not a single scenario. That's one of the important changes that we made post-pandemic. And then there are models for recovery from the event too. But they're quite detailed descriptions of the most severe manifestation of the events. But when it comes to severe weather in the UK, we rarely get things that run beyond the top end. So, for example, the events in there that relate to windstorms are based on the Burns night storm in 1990 and the Great Storm in 87. So that's the kind of top end.
And I would only add to that to say that there's a methodology that sits underneath this as well. So what you're doing is measuring the impact, and that will be across a number of dimensions, including human impact, the economy, just to name two, but there's a long list of different things where there is a clear evidence base which places it within the square that it's in.
And the methodology completely overhauled post-pandemic in partnership with the House of Lords Risk Committee, which was set up for this purpose, and the Royal Academy of Engineering for an independent view. So we have just been through a process to absolutely test and overhaul it.
The reason I asked that question was, do you believe that this would prevent the right proportion of funding being allocated to these, because they're obviously lower risk than some of the other challenges that government are facing, even though we're pretty certain some of this is going to happen?
I mean, as a cluster, they are quite far up. A lot of the risks we deal with are very, very low likelihood. And then you've got some complex questions like what do you do with risks that are very, very low likelihood but very high impact. So there are slightly different funding approaches that you might take to each of them. One of the things we judge is whether you've got sort of repeatability and capacity. But severe weather is interesting as a risk cluster because one, it often has a compounding effect because it runs concurrently with other risks. So we need to be on top of it. Two, it happens an awful lot in the UK, but it doesn't go to the top end that we see in some countries. If you compare it to, say, the biological security risk cluster, they would be slightly further up, but that would include pandemics, so that isn't surprising.
Thank you very much, Ms Blake. Anne-Marie Morris, MP.
Thank you. Mr Clarke, this is all only going to work if there is understanding from the community, from society, so they play their part, and you need to understand their, if you like, perceptions. You say that the whole of society, I think, is one of the three legs of your stool. You also say that you are undertaking a survey of public perceptions of risk. Isn't the problem that perception of risk is going to be about historic risk, and you need people to look at future risk, and unless you begin to explain and articulate, they can never give you a useful answer to enable you to ensure this country is better prepared? Secondly, isn't there an issue about culture change? Because at the moment, people don't see that all of this means they're going to have to change the way they live their lives. What is the government doing to work with people? Because it won't work if you try and do things just to people to get the change. One small example on flooding. In my community, I find that people, they're in a floodplain, a defence system is put in, they are offered money for gates. They won't have the gates because they're worried they won't be able to sell the houses. So that is self-defeating, isn't it? So how are you going to help them understand really what the future risks are to get any sense, and how are you going to get them to understand and accept a change in the way they live their lives?
I may say that's an excellent question, and I mean, in the perceptions of risk, it will not just be asking how prepared do you think you are to what has happened before, but really how prepared do you think the system is, how prepared do you think you are, how far do you understand your own personal role in resilience? Do you, for example, have water at home that you could use if the water went off? Do you, for example, have candles should the power go off? So it's really taking a benchmark, first off, of how prepared people are and how far prepared they think they are, but it also sets out a number of different future scenarios to test this against. So it's not the abstract question, how prepared are you for risk? It really tries to drill down and get some answers which will inform our approach. I mean, then I completely agree with you on this being about culture change. And as always with anything that's culture change, it's big and it takes lots of engagement and lots of conversations. We are having those conversations directly with the public. We have a series of roadshows that have taken place and are planned. We are going to have this public website, as I said, which will really be a portal for people to understand how they can be prepared, the actions that they can take, not just in response to things, but preparing ahead of time as well. And then I would say it's a very developed conversation, isn't it? And it's not something which one website is going to solve. It's not something that a roadshow is going to solve. So I think it's this really interesting debate about the role of the government in supporting public and the communities, and the role of individuals in making sure we have a whole of society resilient state as well. For businesses as well, businesses will have a role that's separate to their individual roles, but you know, it's about having that developed conversation and making sure we're hitting every different part of society, including vulnerable people, and we have some vulnerability guidance which allows us to speak to people about how they may be vulnerable, making sure they get the support they need when something does happen, making sure that there's the preparations in place for those vulnerable people ahead of time. So we've thought really carefully about what are all the different dimensions of society, how do we engage with them effectively directly or through organisations that can represent them, and how do we best talk about the risks and have that conversation about respective roles in that system. So it's a lot to go still, but we're starting that conversation, I think.
Can I just build a little bit on that by just talking about working with our media partners as well, because of course extreme weather is actually how the population experiences and will experience climate change. And we are able to some extent, because we have very good relations with the media and they all carry the severe weather warnings, to draw a distinction between whether you've seen before and whether you haven't seen before. And I think we had fantastic support from across the whole of the UK media in the extreme heat to go, this is not whether you have seen before, and it will require a different response at an individual level, and this is heat that can harm healthy people as well as vulnerable people, and you want to keep your windows and curtains closed, which is not what you normally do on a hot day, and you might want to consider going to a cool place. And that, in all, it's quite hard to characterise which are the heat deaths, because they're not as obvious as deaths from wind and storm, but in terms of the excess deaths we saw subsequently, in all likelihood people did act on that, and certainly we measured the awareness and the people who said they took action, it was up in the high 90s. So I think there is the opportunity, as you said, about a whole of society response. I think responsible media can really assist with helping people adapt.
I'll quick. This smacks still of doing to society, not with society. It really doesn't cut it. They still don't understand what the risk is. You can do what you like, but until they think it's going to happen to them, they're going to ignore it. The work that Ms. Finkelstein has been doing with the water companies to try to get people educated about how much water they use, it's not working unless there's a national campaign and unless we have water meters in our homes that we can actually see how much we're using when we run our bath. It won't happen. So forgive me, Mr. Clarke, Dr. Clarke, this really isn't going to cut it. We are not communicating. People do not really engage and accept and understand the risk, and we have not really got that, if you like, a proper government approach to getting this to work so that longer term we can get the change that we absolutely are going to have, and people are going to have to change the way they live their lives. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms Morris. I'm just want to alert witnesses and members that we are apparently expecting votes at 4 and they're on schedule. So I turn to Jonathan Ginogly MP, but just with that in mind.
Yes, I will keep that in mind. Thank you, Chair. Just moving on from Ms Morris's point, I mean, looking at the planning scenarios, I see that the test is based on working out what constitutes reasonable worst-case scenarios. I mean, anyone who lives in a flood area will know that floods are happening more frequently and with greater severity. So are these reasonable worst-case scenarios being updated, or how are they being updated? Who's best to answer this one?
The reasonable worst-case scenarios appear in a variety of different places. So they appear on the kind of 2 to 5 year time frame in our National Security Risk Assessment. We also use them as tools for shorter-term planning. They are updated very regularly for that kind of operational need, and they are updated periodically for the wider kind of capabilities work in the National Security Risk Assessment. We've just moved to a model where the National Security Risk Assessment is updated out of cycle, so not just every 2 years, but more frequently if that's necessary.
So wait a minute, just on that point, so you have a regular reassessment, and on top of that, if there's an incident, you reassess on the basis of that incident as well?
It can be done, yeah. It's done every 2 years routinely and has been for about 20 years.
Just to add a bit more to that, so this dynamic National Risk Register, so where before it was very periodically based, now if new data comes to light, if a new event happens that changes that perspective, then it can be done on a bespoke basis. But I think also we're bringing other expert voices. There are panels of experts crossing all the disciplines who opine upon these risks and their right placement. But also we are devising a more structured external experts programme as well, so that diverse views can be brought to bear. And it avoids then any perception of groupthink. It does allow us to take on board the views of a wider set of experts as well. So I hope those are both really good improvements that just mean it's more dynamic and takes more data into the process as well.
If we just take one instance, Ms Finkelstein, Storm Babette, could you just explain the process of reassessment following that storm?
We didn't do a reassessment following that storm, I wouldn't say. I mean, I can tell you about things that we learned about from that storm. I could come back to Storm Babette, but just link to the question that you asked.
Yeah.
I think there's something quite important about what is the kind of risk assessment framework we do our long-term planning, because what you described was, you know, a worsening of flood risk over time, and there's something, you know, more than just, you know, have we got the right scenario right now for a response, as to, you know, are we investing properly to deal with the risks that we're seeing? And we're doing a very fundamental reassessment of that risk in our National Floods Risk Assessment, which we'll do by the end of this year, which leads into our long-term investment scenarios, which is going to allow us to do some of our, you know, what's the kind of investment in flood defences and dealing with some of our risks over many decades, so that we do things like, you know, things we're already onto, like Thames Estuary being ready for 2100, because you've got to look at those, you know, the Thames barrier that was mentioned before is not going to be adequate. We have to take a whole-scale new approach to the Thames Estuary. So that was just on that kind of longer-term planning. I mean, in terms of Storm Babette or of any of our kind of recent storms, after each of these storms, we have a look at, you know, what did we experience, what happened, and what can we learn. We do a lessons learned approach. There were a number of lessons that we took from Storm Babette, one of which was being clearer. Storm Babette hit in slightly different areas than that are used to experiencing some of the kind of flooding that happened, and it showed that actually local resilience forums that are less used to dealing with storms and flooding, there was potentially a lack of clarity as to who was doing what. So there's more that we can do about being really clear as to what does the Environment Agency do, what's the local resilience forum expected to do. There was also the potential for confusion between the Met Office information and what the Environment Agency put out in there in terms of their warnings. So again, we've learnt from that as to what we can change, and we also learnt from that quite a lot about how we get much more the information about what's happening get really quickly to everybody, and we actually use some of the improvements when we had Storm Henk. So we learn after each of these storms, and that had some particular areas, rather than us shifting the scenario. But I'll
Storm Babette is quite interesting as a storm. I mean, effectively as a weather event, it kind of stalled over the UK, and so you'd got the rain continuing while the flood event started to emerge. But ultimately it was handled almost entirely at the local level. We did stand up some national structures, but not go sort of all guns blazing, because it was handled so effectively. You know, what the Permanent Secretary's described is something which is about reflecting quite hard and tweaking things so they're good. It wasn't like we sort of reflected on it and saw significant failure in the response. We looked at it and thought, we'll just tweak this, tweak that, and we definitely saw the benefits. One of the interesting things about this storm season is we've been through like 10 named storms. We haven't needed to activate our COBR arrangements at all, because it's all been dealt with so effectively at the local level, and that comes from, you know, not being complacent and continuing to tweak what is a very mature system, rather than just saying it's fine, I'm sure it works.
But the impacts of Storm Babette and Storm Isha were very severe, even though Storm Arwen in November 21, as outlined in the report, had learnt some lessons. So had the lessons and the actions that were taken after, say, Storm Arwen and the other ones in between, why were we still experiencing such problems with Babette and Isha, Ms Finkelstein?
I mean, I would echo. Actually, Isha didn't lead to a lot of flooding for us. It had other issues, but we did find things that we needed to learn and to tweak. But unfortunately, there was a storm. Quite a lot of houses were protected by the defencemen that were in place, but there was flooding. But it didn't look. There was a kind of failure in the response. But there were things, as I was describing, that we learnt from that, and that we led to improvements, particularly I'd say in the way that Storm Henk was dealt with, which again had some flooding effects as well. But we didn't feel that they didn't run effectively as a response exercise.
Professor Endersby, before you come in, it would be helpful to know how the Met Office has listened to in this, because you've got some of the best forecasting available. You're seeing the storms coming through, and you're seeing some of the changes ahead because of your forecasting and satellite work. So, yeah, to answer the question you were going to answer, but also perhaps if you could explain how your work feeds into the resilience planning for future events after a
Absolutely. So I think the point I was going to make first of all was just to agree with Ms Finkelstein about the perhaps the lack of practice of some LRFs, and we should remember that there's a lot of variation year to year in storms, and last year we had no winter storms at all, and then this year we've had a very severe run of them, and so I think there's perhaps we do have a winter resilience network and a summer resilience network where we draw the LRFs together and we talk about what might be coming. But nevertheless, there was perhaps more of an element of lack of practice. I certainly would not say we were out with the reasonable worst case scenario window. If you think about the 1987 storm, we weren't in that kind of we weren't in that kind of territory. I wanted to say something, if I may, about how we do characterise those reasonable worst case scenarios. So, because we're in a changing climate, you can't just look back. We run a technique we call Unseen, where we model 1,000 summers or 1,000 winters in an unchanged climate, in our current climate, and in a number of future climates as well. So we're able to get at the tails of that distribution and say, what does a 1 in 100 year event look like in today's climate or in a 2050 climate? And that information is absolutely taken up and fed into policymakers, like through the National Infrastructure Commission, through DEFRA and so on. In terms of the whole system, I think there's an extremely well-practiced system, coming on to your second question, for how those information is communicated, both to the whole of resilience professionals, largely through the LRFs, as Dr. Clarke said. We have civil contingency advisors, one for every local resilience forum, who help us convey the information that's relevant to them. But obviously we also have the ability to warn the public directly through the National Severe Weather Warning Service, and I have some stats on both for those storms and generally how widely those are taken up.
How stable is your funding for that forecasting?
I can talk to you about our funding.
Is there any risk to it? Because sometimes corners of government can be left well alone, but sometimes there's an easy cut for a central department to make. So I just wonder, whether you feel always under the cosh, or whether you've got a sort of.
We always have to justify the benefit to our funding through a spending review process, and we do that very much through the evidence of the return on investment. But to be honest, for the Met Office, the independent assessment of our return on investment, last time it was done, was 14-1, and it's just been refreshed and it looks like it's going to go up, so we usually are in a strong place to justify that funding. We are largely funded.
We're spending to save with you, basically.
The Public Weather Service customer group, or Public Weather Service, and that funding has been pretty stable, is forecast to rise a little, mostly for the cost of new satellites. It will still have to survive a spending round, but that's what you would expect.
Okay, there's so much more we could go into on this, but I want to come really to the key point. I'll start with Mr. Martin, but we've heard a lot already this afternoon about reaction to issues, 6-month planning, the COBR stuff, dealing with a storm when it arises, and I just really can't quite get my handle on how government is really planning longer term resilience. So Mr. Martin, we've given you one stab at this. Could I start with you, because you're head of the profession? What do you think government could be doing better in simple terms, are the top 2 or 3 things that government could be doing better on long-term resilience? And is there the will behind this in Whitehall? And I suppose politically we can't really answer for the politicians, but is there the will behind this in Whitehall? You're here as the external, sort of an expert in risk, really, from your previous professional background.
Yes, so the specifics of the across Whitehall and ministerial support that Dr. Clarke mentioned earlier on, I think are very strong indicators, and the progress being made that's been outlined in relation to resilience, I think are good indicators of progress, whether that is proactive work in relation to activity which should take place before an incident occurs, or proactive work now which will help in the event that an incident does occur. I think when it comes to risk more broadly, and we touched on this a little bit, it is important to keep in mind, I think, that for most risks we're talking about distributions of outcomes, and so the well-developed methodology takes a point on those distributions for certain risks, but the tail that Professor Endersby was talking about earlier on is always important. I would like that, more of that. I think more of that stochastic assessment of riskiness would be really helpful when having to make really difficult prioritisation calls on investment, whether it's for resilience or other purposes. But it's quite hard to get to because there isn't always the data available, and sometimes the shape of those distributions can be fuzzy. But I think the more we encourage people to think that way when they're making decisions on anything, whether it's about a particular risk or whether it's about a particular policy, a particular programme, the more we get them to think in that distribution type way and think of that overall riskiness and what are all the factors that are influencing the variability of that, then the sharper the interventions can be.
That's really interesting, because sometimes I often say to finance professionals, finance is too important to leave to you. It needs to be embedded in everybody in Whitehall. And what you're saying there is that really risk needs to be better cascaded through the system. So as head of the risk profession, how are you making sure that it's going to not just the risk professionals, but that there's much more learning in the system, that everyone planning a policy or a programme or a delivery is actually thinking about the risks that they're dealing with and mitigating?
Okay, so I might talk about training, I might talk about areas of risk in other processes. So on training, we've been doing a lot as part of the strategy. We have developed a module for new ministers, which...
That's for ministers, for politicians?
That'll be for ministers.
How long is that module?
It forms part of the new minister induction training, so the conversation is likely to be about an hour slot, depending on the way that
nothing.
That
I'm just thinking of a new minister coming in with lots of things on 1 hour. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So, but it's a step forward. New accounting officer training too. We have been developing the risk content in that, and we're threading through that.
New accounting officers, or is that ongoing?
It's been developed for new accounting officers. We have also developed training for senior civil servants that are not risk specialists. That's about to be rolled out, and that's about creating this behavioural environment and the culture to be able to support richer conversations about riskiness. We're also about to launch next month some training for risk specialists in relation to the behavioural elements and how to challenge more effectively upwards and across the organisation. So there's loads on training. There's more that I've mentioned there. In terms of spending in other processes, we've invested a lot of time understanding the way in which the spending reviews work, the way in which the major programmes review group operates, where key decisions are being made on where to spend money. We've looked at the Green Book, we've looked at the Teal Book, which is where programme management guidance is going to come out. We've looked at outcome delivery plans, and in each of those, we've fed in thoughts and ideas as to how we think risk can be better considered in those areas. There is a change journey there because it isn't always sensible, the right thing to do to try and flick the switch and shift that overnight. But the journey we're on, the trajectory we're on, is to bring about some of those shifts.
Well, that's, I suppose, a start. I'll turn to Anne-Marie Morris now to continue this. Ms. Morris.
One of the challenges when you're looking at preparing and responding to extreme weather events is that some parts of the country are inevitably going to be more affected than others. Coastal areas is a prime example, and certainly one of my colleagues, Caroline Lucas, has raised her concern with regard to Brighton. My constituency is in Devon. I've got lots and lots of coastline. Clearly there will be coastal erosion. So in terms of your overall planning, how are you going about trying to identify, and that's just one example, there'll be other things other than coastal erosion, which parts of the country and which geographies are going to be most impacted, and how are you then timelining how you get the preparation done to make sure we're ready for when the event happens? Perhaps I could ask Dr. Clarke.
Are we talking specifically about, kind of flooding type events here?
That's just an example, so I just use coastal erosion as an obvious, because obviously if you don't have a coast, you won't have coastal erosion.
Obviously, that's part of the UK climate projections, so I might just quickly come in on those. So one of the products we produce on behalf of government is the UK climate projections, which talk about how climate change is going to impact the UK on this sort of 2.2 kilometre grid, and that absolutely will include the impacts of sea level rise all the way around the coasts over different time frames in different emission scenarios, and that's something that's very much used by local authorities in their planning as well as in sort of critical national infrastructure planning. I don't know.
How granular is that? Because it's one thing looking at the whole coastline, but some bits are more vulnerable than others, and then you've got the rivers and the estuaries. I mean, it's quite complicated.
2.2 kilometres is the grid size.
There you go.
So really enough to pick, and I live in your constituency, by the way.
There you go.
I go around the coast all the time, but big enough to pick out the Dawlish bit of railway line, for example.
Okay, and does that mean, therefore, there will be preparedness, and maybe Ms Finkelstein's got the answer to this, so that some areas, because that's a particular risk and you've worked out what the timeline of it is likely to be, that you put on your great big grid of risks, that your intervention is then pre-planned and you know that that's going to be a priority?
That's the sort of information that builds into this National Floods Risk Assessment, that feeds into where are we going to invest in flood defences, for example. We have got a specific fund that we're looking particularly at coastal transition. What's the adaptation that's needed in coastal areas? A £36 million fund that we've got supporting specifically in coastal areas. But I know you were giving that as an example of a more general point, but that's the data by place that feeds into our risk assessment that drives our long-term investment planning, but also just our flood defence programme. So it is linked very much to places at greater risk.
Do you have individual place plans?
We do effectively we then, through looking at risk, define places where we're going to do flood defence work built on the risk in that place and the kind of benefits and costs in that place.
More broadly, because as you said quite rightly, this is not just about flooding, it's about all of the risks, and every place has a different mix, a different risk profile. So are there profiles for different places? Aha, Mr. Hargreaves.
Through the Civil Contingencies Act, local responders have an obligation to assess risk in their local area, and they come together through their local resilience forums to have local risk or community risk registers. So that takes information that we supply nationally and combines it with what they generate locally and gives them a kind of ordered risk matrix for their area, which allows them to prioritise their planning. There's obviously then
owns that, because in a sense it's one thing having the data, but then somebody's got to make sure something happens.
They own that locally. They've got a statutory obligation to deliver that collectively, locally, and that's what they do, and in most instances they
do you monitor
that.
Whether they do or don't? Because in a sense it may have an obligation, but how do you know whether or not they deliver on it?
Well, we don't go through and in the Cabinet Office go through and kind of count their risk registers. However, the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities has a team, a resilience directorate, which goes out and engages with local areas. They sit on each of the local resilience forums. They monitor their performance against aspects of the legislation, and if any area is not performing on some aspect of it, they will report it in. That's not a formal inspectorate process. This is not some kind of Ofsted type monitoring. but it is a process to identify areas of weakness, and we make some internal assessments in the centre of areas of strength and weakness relatively between areas, and we make assessment of levels of risk between areas. And if we see an area where there's a high level of risk and a low level of preparedness, we are now able to act in a way that, say, we weren't 3 years ago. But that would be an intervention that wasn't about sort of inspection and enforcement. Yeah. It would be more about what sort of assistance might you need.
I'm listening to that answer carefully, Mr. Hargreaves. I mean, local authorities, the local resilience forum, play a critical part in almost any scenario I can think of. They certainly did during COVID. Where in government are these local resilience forum plans examined for assurance and to make sure that, as Ms. Marie Morris says, that they are actually updating them? Because this is the whole point. There's no point having a plan unless it's consistently updated.
They're not brought in and examined systematically. It was done many, many years ago by the Home Office, when the Home Office had responsibility for this area. It was abandoned, I think, in the early 1990s when it became apparent that everyone was dutifully sending their plans in and no one was looking at them. So,
we have your honesty.
So, a view was formed then that it simply wasn't practical to interrogate these plans. There was discussion at the time that the Civil Contingencies Act was delivered about whether there should be some kind of independent inspectorate be created. Powers were taken in the Act to do that, but at the time it was the general view that the individual inspectorate organisations, like, for example, Inspector of Constabulary, should look at the work of the organisations within their area. However, where we've got some particular areas of risk, we will engage with local areas to look at the quality of their planning, but that's generally from my perspective as we see risks emerge.
So it's risk-led?
So, for example, if we were concerned about the activities of a particular protest group around a particular piece of critical infrastructure or as a kind of pattern for the season ahead, we might talk to local authorities that operated those pieces of infrastructure to understand what they were doing.
What about coastal? Sorry, Sir Geoffrey.
Isn't that a real lacuna in the whole of our emergency planning in this country? We're talking about weather risks here. We're not talking about, so they could hit almost anywhere. And if it wasn't for the the Met Office, with a little bit of warning, we wouldn't know where they were going to hit. So surely it is important that you, at a central government level, do know. And we know that local authorities have a huge difference in their performance, a huge difference in their finances even. Surely somebody ought to be at least casting an eye over these local resilience forums.
Well, I mean, to be straight, there was a choice there that in the past ministers have chosen to exercise in the direction of not doing that kind of formal calling of plans. The powers exist. There's not funding for it at the moment. A subsequent set of ministers.
Well, that's honest. Thank you very much.
Can I just go back to coastal areas? I mean, Ms Morris has mentioned with Dawlish, Caroline Lucas MP sent some information about what's happening in Brighton, which is going to face a lot of challenges. Portsmouth's got its South Sea, got its beach, the measures put in to deal with tidal erosion there. But these are very expensive. I mean, we've got a huge coastline in the UK. I've just picked 3 there. Who is making decisions about whether these local authorities should get more funding for resilience? I mean, local funding goes through the Department for Levelling Up Housing Communities, but it is pretty catastrophic if you're dealing with these weather issues on the coast. So who's making that decision? Is anyone on this table making that decision?
I mean, that we certainly have some of these funds. We are aware, and through the Environment Agency, are making funds that are
through the Environment Agency would be most
through the Environment Agency. So I mentioned the Coastal Transition Accelerators Programme. There's also a sort of flood.
Can I just repeat? Sorry, I can't remember that programme. Is it that people bid for it, or is it allocated according to risk?
I think that is. I'd need to write and tell you exactly how it operates.
It would be helpful to know, because if it's bidding, it does raise rather a number of concerns.
It looks as if there are a number of areas already getting funding through that in East Riding, Norfolk, Dorset, and Cornwall. But I don't have more information.
Helpful if we could find out. And then perhaps back to Mr. Clarke or Dr. Clarke or Mr. Hargreaves. If there is a problem, so Brighton, Hove, Portsmouth, Dawlish, for example. And they've got a really big challenge, and we're getting all the information from the Met Office saying there's a big challenge. Who sees that in the centre and says, actually, there's going to be a big problem if we don't give more money to this council to deal with it? Where does it get? How does it sift up to the top so that you can assess that?
Is that in relation to kind of an emerging and more acute risk?
Yeah, so the longer term risks that are emerging. So the coastal erosion being, obviously one, and flooding at coast.
If we'd got an issue like coastal erosion, then there's, as the Permanent Secretary describes, a kind of broader scheme for funding projects there.
That's very well, that happens, but do you see that from where you are sitting? You are saying it's at the end of this end of the table.
I think if we thought there were acute problems emerging, we have systems to look right across the whole of government and have those filter through to us. But that, from my perspective, is risks that are up to 6 months out. So that's acute problems that are starting to emerge. It's not your point on kind of...
So who in the centre, apart from each department, is looking at that and thinking, look, I mean, so what... I should declare, I grew up in Southsea, and they always said my house that I grew up in would be underwater, I think, by about next year. Happily, it's not, but it was always it seemed like a long way out when I was a kid, but it's actually very real now, that there is a real risk. And with Dawlish, we saw the railway swept away not that many years ago, so there are real issues happening. But where in government is that? Who would have predicted or seen or helped support Dawlish railway station at the time that happened?
DLUC have a large resilience function. They sit on all the local resilience forums, they feed issues through. Some of those will require...
That is the central government mechanism, really.
They're the kind of liaison structure. They will feed acute issues through to me and my team, where there are kind of medium-term or sort of financing issues, structural issues. They might go to the relevant department responsible, but it means we've got kind of eyes on the problem all the time.
Really, DLUC, Mr. Martin, is that good enough for you, that DLUC is holding that risk management and long-term assessment?
That's not something I would feel comfortable, commenting on.
Okay, right. Yeah. So, you do support members of teams in that department in terms of their ability to understand and measure risk?
Yes, because fundamentally, responsibility for risk, the default position is the responsibility for running government. So where it is devolved and where there are local powers and local responsibility for managing risk, they hold that and they retain that. And it's only these sort of exceptional cases where someone from the centre would intervene in relation to that, such as the one that Mr. Hargreaves outlined.
Moving now to Ben Lake MP.
Thank you, Chair. Forgive me, if I can just come back to the LRFs for a moment. Mr. Hargreaves, you explained, that the LRFs will have some sort of input from the Department for Levelling Up, that they will have take some sort of view as to whether they're effective or not, these plans. Is there any discussion at all in government as to whether or not the LRFs have resilience themselves? In other words, the authorities, the public bodies that contribute to the effective execution of some of these plans will have the resources, the staff, what have you, to do it effectively. Is there a view at all, or process in central government to just have a horizon scanning moment, I suppose, to see, can we actually depend on the continued functioning of these LRFs in the future? Because as Dr. Clarke explained, they're quite integral to the response to some of these extreme weather events.
It's probably a sort of narrow answer to that and a broader answer. The narrow answer is local responders have statutory obligations to maintain not just emergency plans but also their own business continuity arrangements and so forth. So they have an obligation to be able to respond. The system operated by DLUC means that where we identify problems with people's capacity to respond, that is picked up quickly and passed through to us, and we can contemplate what sort of operational support we provide. There is, of course, a broader issue, which is to say that local responders are the kind of sum of their parts, and the challenges that some local responders have in terms of their capacity and their focus is well documented. When a local authority engages in a response to, for example, house a large number of evacuees from whichever latest place we're evacuating people from, it's not about the strength of their emergency planning team alone. It's about the strength of their social services department, their children's services, their ability to kind of muster effective executive decision making, to draw on other partners locally. And so we can kind of fix our bit, but we're also only as strong as the broader system. And that's generally true of resilience issues in the round. Resilience is often a function of the amount of capacity and capability of a system more generally.
I just wanted to say a little more about the Stronger LRFs programme. So this is the thing that has been announced where you're really embedding resilience in the political decision making locally. So where resilience is important within those wider services that Mr. Hargreaves talked about, those decisions are being made at top level in those LRFs. There's a pilot across 8 local resilience forums being rolled out, and that will really be a test of how that could be rolled out across the piece. So taking the evidence from that programme and building out from there.
Thank you. If I can move on then to finance, and specifically what the government is doing or intends to do to try and encourage greater private sector investment in extreme weather resilience. Dr. Clarke.
Yep. So in the Green Finance Strategy last year, which was called Mobilising Green Investment, this was really about working with private sector partners to improve the approach to climate resilience assessment and disclosure, and then really trying to collaborate in making sure that those things that need to be funded are funded, including through the UK Infrastructure Bank. There was a goal within that for £500 million of private finance per year into nature's recovery in England by 2027, rising to more than £1 billion per year by 2030. Then I'd also add that the government's considering inclusion of an adaptation objective in the upcoming UK Green Taxonomy, which again will really help adaptation activities to be defined as something that should be invested in by the private sector as well as by government.
That's good to hear. Can I ask, in terms of your own work, how closely do you work with regulators such as Ofgem or Ofwat? Because it strikes me that they have quite an influential role, especially in some of this infrastructure. Network Rail is another one, when they set the control periods for investment. Yep. How much of an input, how does that work?
It's a really important point, and a point which the National Infrastructure Commission have made as well, whereby there's a window going forward, and we want to make sure that our interventions are getting ahead of those spending control periods. So I do work with the regulators, both individually, but there are 13 critical national infrastructure sectors, and if I were to meet all of them all the time, that would clearly be quite difficult. But I have regular meetings with the UK Regulators Network. I have meetings and more lined up with the Institute of Regulation, so really trying to take a holistic piece here. And of course working through the departments who have those relationships with the regulators for their sectors as well.
And so at the moment, do these regulators, take Ofwat as an example, there could be a situation, freeze-thaw incidents, they happen. We had one about 2 years ago in my own part of the world, where unexpected changes in temperature meant that just in my own constituency, nearly 5,000 homes were without water for about a week. What discussions or responsibility is there on Ofwat to build into their expectations of the water companies' plans to invest and improve resilience in their infrastructure, as it's becoming evident now that there are these extreme weather events that can have a serious, unexpected perhaps, but in terms of timing, but if in a changing climate we expect these instances to occur more frequently, then is there a responsibility on Ofwat to take that to the water companies and say, look, you need to build into your investment plans a credible sort of solution to make your infrastructure more resilient to these instances?
Yeah, I can give that example of water. I mean, the water companies are required to produce water resource management plans, which that looks ahead and gives assurance as to it sets out what's kind of investment that needs to happen in order to assure that water supply into the future. So they've just done a draft set that'll be finalised by the end of this year, and a whole set of investments they are expecting to made in reservoirs, in various ways in which water transfers can happen, etc. So they are required to do that, and then what they are required to do and what they are able to raise funding to do is then agreed as part of our price review mechanism. But it's absolutely stitched into an aspect of what Ofwat is looking to them to do. Right,
so I'd be correct in understanding that it's a role or a responsibility in Ofwat to ensure that this sort of resilience...
It's stitched into the whole price review process, that bit of what water companies are expected to do, they have to show the investment they're going to make to do that.
And then I appreciate that water is just one example. But is there a similar sort of responsibility on regulators of other sort of key national infrastructure?
Yeah, so Ofgem, for example, I do know that there's those conversations about resilience and the particular standards and requirements within licence conditions as well. Yeah.
I think it's in the process of being upgraded through the National Infrastructure Commission's work on climate resilience as well, because they've had conversations with us about what data regulators should be requiring infrastructure operators to use. So I think it's still being built into the full breadth of critical national infrastructure, but it's definitely an improving picture.
And forgive me for just one last question, if I may. Is it your understanding that it'll be the Infrastructure Commission that will have the role of just sense checking that all the different regulators have a correct understanding of the type of resilience we're looking for and want them to impose on the relevant companies?
I think broadly, yes, they will have a role in that, and those are the conversations which I am having with the NIC as well to make sure that it's a coherent system across the board.
Who does the assurance that those plans are good? Presumably, Ms Finkelstein, for water, it would be your department to make sure that the
water. Well, Ofwat will ensure that. That
so they will, but Ofwat, if Ofwat are requiring it, who assures that Ofwat are asking for the right thing, given we're talking about risk here?
Well, we set we have a national policy statement where we set what we require of Ofwat through the price review, but an aspect of that is that they need to ensure that the water resource management plan are funded. So that's
and you're confident that happens smoothly and properly?
Yes.
Okay. Right,
that is a.
Well, we haven't got time. Ms Blake, did you want to come in? Sorry, I wasn't sure if you were indicating there. Just on that point.
No, I just think it's an interesting question about how that joins up, because we had a major incident in my constituency, and Ofgem and Ofwat both got involved because it was a.
Do you want to explain the incident? Because it was a quite extraordinary incident.
Asbestos water pipe that water released and bore a hole in the gas main. And millions and millions and millions of litres were allowed to pump into the gas main, which meant that water then came out of people's gas fires and their gas cookers with such force it was hitting the ceiling. It was an absolute disaster and it affected thousands of people. But the gas main was a new main. So it's kind of like, when there's infrastructure discussions going on, how do you make sure that you're seeing right across the picture in terms of investment, and that government priorities about resilience actually deal with some of those cross-cutting issues of where things are located, for example? I guess was my thought.
Is that something that crosses your radar, Mr Clarke, Dr Clarke?
I mean, look,
Mr Hargreaves, in the moment it was it would be it would be
we encounter the kind of it's not mine, it's yours to deal with problem all the time. I fear it's a feature of kind of humankind. Organisations don't necessarily want to take responsibility for everything, and often these are complex intertwined problems, and we will find ourselves in some instances interceding to pick through that. It's particularly relevant where you've got kind of local incidents at the boundary between public sector bodies and private sector bodies. Oftentimes some of the private sector demarcations are clearer, or they're more confident about covering costs and then sorting it out subsequently. But it is something that we see, and I don't see an easy remedy to it, because ultimately these things are all going to be in slightly different ownership. What we can do, or what the LRF can do, is step in to say, right, regardless of how we pick through this, we will find a solution now and then come back to it. And we've done it in several instances over the last couple of years, where we have sort of stepped in to effectively bankroll local authorities so they can be the force for good within the system as the kind of lead agent for the public sector.
To be honest, it wasn't a problem so much between they dealt very well with it and just got on with it, and afterwards it's the whose fault is it, which is fine. But I guess my question really is about how do we make sure that 1970s infrastructure is on your radar? It's for, if there's going to be a gas upgrade that's going on, how is it resilient if it's next to 1970s water infrastructure? Is kind of the point. How do you see those risks? Consequences?
And that would be above the local resilience form, surely.
But that are you talking about the kind of building controls element of it? Because certainly where major infrastructure goes in, there's a very, very tight process around
awareness of that risk. It's probably not anywhere on the gas companies' radar that their pipes are going to be a problem because they're brand new pipes. Do you know what I mean? But
their silo, it's a good
it's siloing of it. How do you bring it together into the real world, I guess, is my question.
Do you offer guidance? I mean, is there any guidance issue to companies through any, through other...
I mean, generally
regulators.
There's a lot of building, control mechanisms around new infrastructure, how it intersects with existing infrastructure, the mapping of infrastructure. Many of those utilities are either hold those records or work to extend them. Very, very old infrastructure occasionally.
Well, I think with your CV, I mean, we could go down a whole squirrel hole on this, but let's be clear. After Grenfell, and then now the secondary legislation has now been passed about keeping a map of what's going on in flats, so that there's records, and that's loads of blocks of flats that don't have that, and it's going to take years to get. So the idea that it's all perfect, I'm not suggesting you were saying this, but let's be clear that there's an awful lot of gaps.
I'm just saying that they are kind of, from what we see, they're alive to the problem, and it's something that, because of that, very, very rarely comes up to our sort of level of interest. But I'm not suggesting for a second it's a non-problem. It's probably a very significant problem, but it sort of manifests locally.
I think I can move on to Jonathan.
Thank you, and I'll be brief, Chair. I mean, again on infrastructure, we've been concentrating on Ofwat, but as the NAO report actually says, and as Ms Finkelstein also made clear, Ofwat is the exception because it has an explicit adaptation requirement. But the NAO report also says at 310, it says most infrastructure regulators do not have specific duties regarding climate resilience. So Ofwat is the exception to that. So, I mean, what about the rest of them? I mean, how are we going to give regulators consistent climate resilience roles? What's missing here? Dr. Clarke.
Yeah, I mean, that is part of the mapping that we're doing, which is really understanding the current regulatory landscape across all of those critical national infrastructure sectors, the ones that deliver the critical services we rely on, and that is the aim. I mean, we have the aim in the resilience framework that the 2030 regulating where needed in this place, but as I said earlier, it's not. We have a jolly until 2030 and then it's magically in place. We really want to build the evidence base, work out where the regulation sits, where there are current standards, whether those are good enough, and then put in place something that's coherent and consistent. And that could be kind of vertical regulation where you're looking at individual sectors, or it could be something horizontal where we say, you're all important sectors, you all need to meet a resiliency requirement to be able to deal with a 1 in X year event, and that's what we are building the evidence base to inform the approach that we take, horizontal, vertical, or thematically based, about some of the adaptation risks that we've been talking about.
And we do see it, operate in practice effectively. It's not always the case that those resilience obligations are framed around a particular risk. Like severe weather or a driving force like climate change. Often they're about outcomes. So, customers must get access to X litres of potable water every day, sort of thing. But if you take, for example, Storm Arwen, when that occurred 2 or 3 years ago, we saw a very large number of customers disconnected on an extended basis. The response to that was a recognition from ministers and I think from the industry as a whole that they'd not done a good enough job, and it was Ofgem that led the work with then the business department to put together a very comprehensive lessons learned report that they then took to operators and that we saw operators respond to. So if you look at Storm Arwen, you have 40,000 customers off supply for more than 3 days, 4,000 off for more than a week. That's very difficult for those people, and it was very difficult for us looking at it and not necessarily having the levers, because the levers need to come from the companies. Subsequent events, Storm Eunice, some of the more recent events, we've seen the operators change their procedures, be much more proactive and actually respond, and it was the regulator that played a central role on behalf of the Secretary of State to make that happen. So it does feel to us like the regulators have a lot of focus and a lot of traction here.
The implication of that is there's more going on with the regulators than appears in this NAO report.
I think so, and I think they will have general continuity of service requirements for, so whether it be electricity or water or whatever, and the companies in meeting that obligation to provide the water or the electricity will be looking at our national risk register and saying, are we prepared for the risks that are set out here? And then they'll need to make the plans and justify that through the regulator that they are managing the risks, and they'll need to provide evidence, and will be inspected, and enforcement will be in place as well. So I wouldn't want the perception to be, because we're not from the top of government defining standards across the piece here, that there's not already those outcome-based standards across the utilities.
Yeah, I'm hearing stories of bits and pieces going on here and there, but not a coherent.
And that's the mapping. That's the mapping,
and that seems very slow.
Just to say, I mean, the distinction is in terms of our system, we have quite vertical regulation in terms of these sectors. So where we regulate the performance of water companies, we do it as a whole. So we do the economic regulation, the safety regulation, and the resilience is part of that. And the same will be true of energy, or whichever sector we pick. It would be possible to switch that round and do more vertical regulation. And so effectively you have common resilience expectations across all sectors, and they're defined uniformly.
You mean for horizontal?
Horizontal, sorry, yeah. And so the Australians have looked at doing more of that kind of thing, but it's proven very difficult, because essentially you're swapping one problem for another.
Do any of you, the three of you at this end of the table, make these recommendations to anybody that maybe there's a different way of doing it?
We look doing the work exactly to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
If you want to, if you decide that you want to take an aspect of regulation of energy companies out of the very, very complex energy regulation system, you've then got to build a really complex interface between this bespoke bit of regulation and the general system, and where costs are imposed by your bespoke system, they need to be factored into the broader system.
So it's challenging.
It's not impossible, but the Australians looked at it, thought it was a good idea, and it proved pretty tricky, and they're stalling a bit on it.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
So,
Mr. Clarke.
I was only going to say, in recognition of that complexity, is why originally an achievable date of 2030 was given. But I really want to be clear, that's not meaning that we're aiming for 2030. We want to do it sooner, and we're working with the NIC and others who are advocating for much sooner than that.
And is there some kind of work plan here that
absolutely yes
can be seen?
Yeah, can we see it?
We can set out the engagement that we're doing and the broad plans, yes.
Yeah. I mean, if we often, even if there are any elements of it that may be for national security purposes, not public, we do often get access to government papers. I'm sure Ms. Finkelstein will testify to this, which we read appropriately and do not reveal. We've never leaked anything in the last decade. So if we could push that would be good. Can I just, before we finish, just ask you, Dr. Clarke, how big your team is?
We normally disclose exactly that, so I have
however you measure it,
I have a team of 78 people.
They're all based in the Cabinet Office with you?
They're based in the Cabinet Office, yes.
Okay. And how senior are those people?
Does
that include the vote sort of down to AO level, or is it more senior?
It's the whole spectrum of people, from the deputy directors I have through the whole spectrum of grades, yes.
Okay, so every grade. And Mr. Hargreaves, same questions for you.
About 110.
Okay, and how senior? Or expert? I mean, that's a bit of a proxy for senior.
Is it?
Perhaps not in the civil.
I'm not sure it is anywhere. But we have, there's a senior management team to allow us to cover all our responsibilities, and then we have people doing a whole range of specialist roles. Quite a lot of my team do quite technical or specialist
things. I imagine
things.
in your field.
We've got a lot of people with kind of accumulated, quite in-demand crisis management skills. The other thing I will just observe, though, about resource is we've done a lot of work since the pandemic to really overhaul the way we operate resource. We are engaged in a very, very large-scale training programme for everyone in government on crisis management, which is now seeing all permanent secretaries, all directors general, all senior officials, all new fast streamers, and a very large cohort of other officials trained in the disciplines of effective crisis response, which is quite profound.
What is the turnover like in your teams? Are people on sort of rotation, so they come for two years and then move on, or do you have people who specialise?
We have a mixture of people, some who are new arrivals, some who will do what might be a sort of typical 2 or 3 years in role, and we have people who have been around since I was in Civil Contingency Secretariat 15, 16 years ago, so we have a range of expertise.
Mr. Hargreaves, similar for you?
Mine tend to stay on for longer. I mean, the work is very interesting, but also the kind of accumulated knowledge that you get makes you more effective.
That's my point, really. Okay.
And then we've got quite a lot of people in technical roles where the kind of specialisation is high, and if I can afford to pay them enough to keep them and stop them going to the private sector, then
you do. Okay.
I do.
Then finally, Mr. Martin, you've got this overarching responsibility for the risk function. We heard a lot about the challenges. What powers or freedoms would help you develop the risk profession and develop the risk understanding and resilience understanding across Whitehall? What this is your moment to ask, given that we're going to be writing a report on this in
point of clarification, suppose there isn't a risk function per se with a capital F. My team, which is a very small risk centre of excellence, is housed within government finance function as part of Treasury, and a remit is to look across the piece. So I have a very small team. I consider a group of about 1,200 risk specialists across government that we've connected with and that we meet with very regularly now. We share information with each other. I consider that to be my extended team, and of course everyone has responsibility for the management of risk. We are developing the strategy which was outlined a couple of years ago, and we've been delivering on that. And as part of that, and as part of the work I mentioned earlier, where we're looking at all the different parts of what I call the risk management machinery of government, opportunities may emerge which require the sort of change of authority or that you pointed to. So I think we're addressing it through that work, and we're seeking those improvement opportunities through that.
Okay, that's diplomatically put. Okay, thank you. Now, thank you very much indeed for your time. The transcript of this session will be available on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days, and we'll be producing a report which is likely to come after the Easter recess, assuming we don't have an election call before then. If there's an election call, we'll move a bit faster. Again, I thank you very much indeed for your time. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.